My name is Kaylee Davis. I am 34 years old, and 20 minutes before my grandfather's funeral began, my father stepped into the center aisle of a Boston cathedral to tell me I did not exist. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. He simply handed me a funeral program, gripped my elbow hard enough to leave a bruise through my wool coat, and told me to leave through the side door before he had the ushers throw me out into the rain. The heavy cream cardstock in my hand listed the surviving family of Harrison Davis, Thomas Davis, Evelyn Davis, Preston Davis. My name had not been crossed out with a pen. It had been deleted entirely. The margins of the text were perfectly justified to hide the space where I used to be. My own family had hired a graphic designer to ensure my erasure looked intentional and pristine. They thought the worst thing that could happen that morning was me sitting in the second row ruining their curated corporate optics. They were wrong. What happened when my grandfather's notoriously private attorney burst through those heavy oak doors holding a wax-sealed envelope changed the trajectory of our entire bloodline. My parents never saw it coming, and honestly, neither did I. Welcome to Linda Vengeance, where we tell the stories of quiet people who finally stop paying for someone else's peace. If you have ever been cut out by the people who share your last name, I want to know how old you were when you realized their love came with a price tag. Tell me your age in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe, because the payout in this story is something you will want to hear. Let me take you inside that cathedral. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in November. The air inside the sanctuary was thick with the smell of damp wool, burning beeswax, and the suffocating sweetness of white lilies. I stood near the vestibule, my black umbrella dripping onto the centuries-old marble floor. I am a senior corporate auditor. I make my living finding discrepancies in ledgers, tracking hidden accounts, and reading the behavioral anomalies of nervous executives in boardrooms. I do not panic. I observe. And what I observed in that church made the breath stall in my lungs. The front 4 rows of pews were cordoned off with thick velvet ropes. My brother Preston and his wife Clara stood near the altar. Clara was adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet, looking around the room as if assigning a dollar value to every guest who walked in. Preston was checking his luxury watch, his foot tapping a rapid, impatient rhythm against the stone floor. Neither of them looked like people who had just lost the patriarch of their family. They looked like people waiting for a bank to open. I took a step toward the center aisle, intending to take my usual seat. That is when my father, Thomas, materialized from the shadows near the baptismal font. He wore a charcoal morning suit that cost more than my first car. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle pulsed beneath his skin. He stepped directly into my path. His broad shoulders blocked my view of the altar. "Your seat is gone, Kaylee," he whispered. His voice was a flat, controlled razor blade. "We cannot afford any disruptions today. This service requires a clean family image." I looked at the program in my hand, then back up to his face. I had eaten Sunday breakfast with Grandpa Harrison every week for 10 years. Harrison taught me how to read a profit and loss statement on his porch in Cape Cod when I was 12. He was the only person in this family who looked at me like I was a person and not a public relations liability. "My seat is in the second row, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I did not call him Dad. I had stopped using that word a long time ago. My father leaned in closer. I could smell his expensive cologne masking the sour scent of nervous sweat. "You were never really part of this family," he said, dragging the words out slowly. "You are an auditor who happened to share our last name. You embarrass us with your questions and your constant need to look under the rug. Now turn around and walk out the side exit before I call security." My hands trembled. I tightened my grip on the edge of the stiff paper program to hide it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to push past him and walk down that aisle. But an auditor knows when the numbers are stacked against them. Causing a scene here would only give my mother the exact ammunition she needed to tell her country club friends that I was unstable. Logic dictated a strategic retreat. I would say my goodbyes to Harrison on my own time. I took a slow breath and prepared to turn around. But before I could pivot, a sound caught my attention. Just a few feet away, near the edge of the velvet rope, my mother, Evelyn, was fussing over Preston. She smoothed the lapel of his custom suit, her manicured fingers plucking an invisible piece of lint from his shoulder. She leaned in, her voice cutting through the low hum of the organ music. "Chin up," Preston, Evelyn murmured. Her tone was sharp, urgent. "The buyers are sitting in the third row. You need to look the part." Buyers. The word hit my brain like a cold splash of water. Harrison had owned Atlantic Maritime Logistics, a sprawling shipping empire he built from a single cargo boat. His heart had stopped beating exactly 72 hours ago. A funeral is a space for grief. It is a space for eulogies and quiet reflection. It is no place for corporate buyers. I looked at my father again. The hostility in his eyes was a familiar fixture of my childhood. But the tight, frantic energy radiating from his posture was new. He was not just embarrassed by my presence. He was terrified. He was guarding that aisle like a hired mercenary because whatever was happening in the front rows of that church had nothing to do with honoring a dead man. It was a transaction. I slipped the fraudulent funeral program into the pocket of my wool coat. I met my father's eyes offering him nothing. No tears, no anger, just a blank receipt of his cruelty. I turned toward the heavy brass handle of the vestibule door. Then the oak doors burst open from the outside. A bitter gust of Massachusetts wind whipped through the entry hall, carrying a spray of freezing rain. Julian Sterling stood in the threshold. Julian Sterling was Harrison's private corporate counsel. He was a man who billed by the minute, despised small talk, and famously never left his high-rise corner office unless a deal was worth 9 figures. Today, his expensive trench coat was soaked through the shoulders, his chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths, and his leather shoes squeaked loudly against the wet marble floor. Thomas immediately dropped his hostile posture. He painted on a polished, grieving executive smile and stepped forward, extending a hand. "Julian, thank you for making it. We have a seat reserved for you down front." Sterling did not even look at him. He walked straight past my father, his wet coat brushing against Thomas's charcoal suit. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Sterling reached into his leather satchel. He did not pull out a legal brief or a stack of condolence cards. He extracted a thick, heavy brown envelope. My eyes immediately dropped to the closure. It was not sealed with standard legal tape. A thick puddle of deep red wax secured the flap, bearing the heavy, unmistakable impression of a compass rose. Harrison's personal signet, Ms. Davis, Sterling said. His voice echoed in the quiet stone vestibule, deep and gravelly. He held the envelope out to me, bypassing the surviving family entirely. "Your grandfather left very strict instructions. This was to be delivered to you and only you before he went into the ground." My father lunged forward, his polished smile vanishing, replaced by a look of naked panic. Thomas closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. The polished morning facade evaporated, replaced by the raw, predatory instinct of a cornered executive. He used his height, looming over me, attempting to eclipse the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. He reached his large hand over my shoulder, aiming directly for the brown paper in Sterling's grip. "Give me that," Thomas ordered. His voice hit the tight, rumbling register he reserved for boardroom disputes and insubordinate employees. "Those are private family records. You have 0 right to withhold them from the primary estate executors." Sterling did not flinch. He merely shifted his weight, rotating his shoulder just enough to let my father's hand grasp empty air. The attorney's expression remained carved from granite, betraying no emotion. "You are mistaken," Thomas Sterling replied. His tone was chillingly polite, the kind of polite that precedes a devastating lawsuit. "This envelope contains 0 personal correspondence. It is a corporate directive from the late founder of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. Attorney-client privilege dictates it belongs exclusively to the recipient named on the front." Sterling extended his arm further toward me, offering the package like a loaded weapon. I reached out and took it. The paper felt heavy, rigid with the weight of whatever legal mechanisms my grandfather had set in motion before his lungs failed. I ran my thumb over the thick, raised puddle of deep red wax holding the flap shut. The indentation was unmistakable. A compass rose. Harrison had worn that signet ring every day of his life. He built his shipping empire by navigating treacherous waters, both literal and financial. He used to tell me, a compass is useless if your hands are shaking. You have to hold it steady, let the needle find north, and trust your bearing, regardless of the hurricane spinning around you. My father was the hurricane, right now radiating nervous heat and suppressed rage. I decided to be the compass. I kept my breathing even, my spine straight, and my grip on the envelope relaxed. Seeing Thomas fail to intimidate Sterling, my mother deployed her own tactical maneuver. Evelyn moved gracefully past the velvet ropes, her expensive black heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She wore a dark lace veil that framed her face, her eyes wide with manufactured maternal concern. The heavy scent of her jasmine perfume cut through the smell of the church lilies, cloying and invasive. "Kaylee, darling," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a sugary cadence that made my stomach tighten. She reached out to touch my arm, a gesture she only performed when an audience was present to witness her grace. "This is a day for unity. We are all hurting so much. Whatever Harrison left for you, we should read it together. Let us step into the rectory, sit down as a family, and process this properly." An amateur would have heard an olive branch. An auditor hears a fishing attempt. Evelyn did not want to comfort me. She wanted to crowd me into a windowless room, corner me with Thomas, and confiscate whatever leverage Harrison had just handed me. She wanted to break my focus and use my grief as a lockpick. I looked at Evelyn's hand resting on my coat sleeve. Her nails were perfectly manicured, painted a muted, tasteful beige. I looked past her shoulder to Preston, still standing by the altar, glaring at me with undisguised contempt. Unity was a fiction they sold to their country club friends to keep up appearances. "I appreciate the offer, Evelyn," I said, keeping my vocal cords relaxed and my pitch even. "But Harrison hired a corporate attorney to deliver this, not a grief counselor. I will review it on my own time." I hoisted my leather briefcase onto the flat stone edge of a nearby baptismal font. I deliberately turned my back to my parents, shielding the mechanism with my body. I unclasped the brass latches, placed the brown envelope inside next to my laptop, and closed the lid. Snap, snap. The twin metallic clicks echoed through the quiet vestibule. That small, definitive sound seemed to fracture something inside my father. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The veins in his neck pulsed against his starched white collar. He was used to subordinates yielding to his volume and daughters yielding to his disapproval. My stillness enraged him far more than a screaming match ever could. I gave him nothing to react to. No anger, no tears, no compliance. "You are making a terrible mistake," Thomas hissed, his voice vibrating with restrained fury. "If you walk out that door with company property, I will tie you up in litigation until you cannot afford groceries. I will ruin your career before the sun sets." Julian Sterling stepped between us, acting as a physical barrier. He leaned in close to my ear, his breath smelling of bitter black coffee and peppermint. "Read those documents in a highly secure location," Kaylee Sterling whispered. The urgency in his voice cut through his usual detached professionalism, signaling real danger. "Do not open them here. Do not open them anywhere your family has access. Go. Now." I nodded once to the attorney. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the people who shared my DNA, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The Boston weather hit me like a physical blow. The freezing rain lashed against my face, soaking my hair before I could even deploy my umbrella. The sky was the color of bruised iron, matching the cold gray buildings lining the street. I hurried down the wet stone steps, my heels slipping slightly on the slick pavement, my mind racing through the variables. Harrison had orchestrated this drop-off perfectly. He knew Thomas would try to intercept the mail. He knew Evelyn would try to manipulate the narrative. He waited until the one moment they were pinned down by public optics to hand me the keys to whatever kingdom he had hidden away. He used their own vanity against them. I reached the sidewalk and began walking briskly toward the subway entrance. I needed to get back to my apartment, lock the deadbolt, and break that wax seal. The cold water seeped through the shoulders of my coat, but the chill kept my mind sharp. Deep inside my pocket, my cell phone vibrated. I ignored it. It vibrated again, then a third time in rapid succession. The rhythmic buzzing felt like an alarm bell warning of an incoming strike. I ducked under the canvas awning of a closed coffee shop to escape the driving rain. Shifting the heavy leather briefcase to my left hand, I pulled the phone from my pocket. The screen illuminated the dim gray space around me. 3 new messages, all from Preston. My brother never texted me. We had not exchanged a digital word in over 2 years, not since he skipped my graduation to attend a golf tournament in Florida. We did not share pleasantries. We did not share holidays. I swiped the screen to open the thread. There was no greeting. There was no mention of the funeral starting without me. There was no fake sympathy. There was only a single, taunting sentence, followed by a digital document attachment. We executed the trust amendment this morning. You get nothing. I stared at the glowing pixels. A droplet of freezing rain rolled off my wet hair and landed on the glass screen, magnifying the word nothing. My chest tightened. Probate courts require months to process a standard will. A judge has to verify the signatures, read the terms, and allow for contests. A trust amendment, however, bypasses a judge entirely. It is a private mechanism. It goes into effect the second the ink dries and the notary stamps the page. Preston was not threatening to cut me out of the inheritance eventually. He was telling me they had already rewritten history before Harrison was even in the ground. They had found a legal loophole to strip me of my legacy, my executive authority, and my connection to the only man who ever loved me. The battlefield had just shifted beneath my feet. This was no longer a dispute over a seat in a church or a quiet family feud. This was an active, aggressive, legal war, and my family had fired the first shot with devastating speed. I tapped the PDF icon to open the file, my thumb hovering over the screen, preparing to read the lie they had authored. The subway ride back to my apartment was a blur of damp wool coats and the screeching brakes of the train cars. I did not sit down. I stood holding the metal pole, staring at the blurred reflection of my own face in the dark glass of the window. The freezing rain had soaked through my collar, chilling my skin, but I welcomed the cold. It kept my mind sharp. It kept the grief locked in a neat, compartmentalized box at the back of my brain. I needed clinical focus. My family had just declared war, and they had chosen a battlefield I knew better than anyone. I lived in a high-rise building in the Seaport District. My apartment was stark, minimalist, and quiet. There were no photographs of my parents, no sentimental clutter from my childhood, only clean lines and glass surfaces. It was an environment built for concentration. I walked through the front door, peeled off my wet coat, and dropped it onto a chair. I carried my leather briefcase to the glass desk in the center of the living room. The twin brass latches echoed in the silent room as I opened it. I took out the thick brown envelope Julian Sterling had handed me in the church. The red wax seal bearing Harrison's compass rose caught the pale light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The urge to break that wax and read my grandfather's final instructions tugged at my chest. But an auditor tackles the most immediate threat first. The envelope was secure. Preston's text message was a ticking clock. I pulled my phone from my pocket and synced it to my desktop computer. I needed a larger screen. The PDF attachment from my brother transferred over, appearing as a stark white square in the center of my monitor. I clicked the file. The document loaded, revealing 3 pages of dense legal jargon. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, First Amendment to the Harrison Davis Revocable Living Trust. My stomach dropped, leaving a cold, hollow space behind my ribs. When a person dies with a standard will, the estate goes through probate. Probate is a public, drawn-out court process. A judge verifies every signature, catalogs every asset, and allows estranged relatives to contest the terms. It takes months, sometimes years. A revocable living trust is a different mechanism entirely. It is a private vault. Whatever you put inside that vault belongs to the trust, not the person. When the creator dies, the appointed successor trustee simply takes over the vault. No judges, no court dates, no waiting periods. The transition of power happens the second the creator stops breathing. My grandfather had established his trust years ago to protect his maritime holding company from corporate vultures. He had named me as his primary successor. We had drafted the paperwork together in his study. The document on my screen was a counterfeit reality. I read the paragraphs, my eyes scanning the crisp black text. The amendment formally revoked my status as successor trustee, citing a recent and irreconcilable estrangement. It named Thomas Davis and Preston Davis as the sole controllers of the estate. With a few forged paragraphs, my father and brother had granted themselves immediate, uncontested authority over the sprawling Cape Cod property and the voting shares of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. They had bypassed the law by utilizing the very shield Harrison built to protect us. The sheer audacity of the lie stole my breath for a fraction of a second. But only a fraction. Grief is a heavy, blinding fog. Auditing is a bright, unforgiving spotlight. I pushed the daughter aside and let the senior corporate auditor take the keyboard. When people construct a lie of this magnitude, they focus on the grand narrative. They focus on the signatures and the legal phrasing. They always forget the microscopic details. Criminals trip over the pebbles, not the boulders. I zoomed in on the bottom of the third page. There, sitting next to Harrison's shaky signature, was the official blue ink stamp of a public notary. I stared at the circular seal, reading the tiny text bordering the edge. State of Massachusetts, Berkshire County. My fingers went still on the mouse. Harrison Davis was a coastal man. He breathed salt air and spent his entire life watching the tides. He hated the mountains. He claimed the elevation gave him migraines and the air was too thin to think straight. He had not traveled to Berkshire County in 12 years. Yet this official stamp claimed a notary had witnessed his signature in a jurisdiction he despised just weeks before his death. It was a sloppy error. But a geographical inconsistency was circumstantial. I needed empirical proof. I needed the math. I closed the PDF reader and right-clicked on the raw file icon resting on my desktop. I selected the Properties tab, navigating away from the text and diving into the digital metadata. Every digital document carries a hidden footprint. It records the exact device used to create it, the software utilized, and the precise moment it was birthed into existence. I scrolled down to the timestamps. Harrison's heart monitor had flatlined in the intensive care unit on Friday evening at 9:14. I knew the exact minute because I was holding his hand when the machine let out that long, terrible note. The creation date embedded in Preston's PDF read Sunday, 11:40 in the morning. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking in the silent apartment. The document granting my father and brother total control of a shipping empire was typed, finalized, and digitally stamped 48 hours after the man who supposedly signed it was placed in a morgue. The forgery was confirmed. The weapon was in my hands. But a digital timestamp on an emailed file is easily dismissed in a boardroom as a computer glitch or a clerical saving error. To prove the document was a fabrication, I needed to cross-reference it against the original trust schedules, his authentic signature logs, and his encrypted tax history from the past 3 years. Those files were not on a cloud server. They were too sensitive. They were stored on the encrypted hard drive of my personal laptop. I closed my eyes, mapping out the physical location of my hardware. I had been visiting Harrison at the Cape Cod estate the night he collapsed. We had been sitting in his mahogany study. When the ambulance arrived, I dropped everything and rode with him to the hospital. My laptop, carrying the forensic accounting software and the original digital backups, was still sitting on his heavy wooden desk, right next to the brass reading lamp. I needed to retrieve that machine before Thomas realized what was on it. If they destroyed my hard drive, the metadata on Preston's PDF would be reduced to my word against theirs. I had to secure the physical evidence. I stood up from the desk, grabbing my car keys. I reached for the wax-sealed envelope Sterling had given me, intending to bring it with me to the coast. Before my fingers brushed the brown paper, the intercom mounted on the wall near my front door let out a sharp, piercing buzz. I paused, my hand hovering over the desk. I was not expecting visitors. My friends knew I was at a funeral, and my family was currently standing in a church celebrating their successful coup. I walked over to the panel and pressed the silver button. Yes, Ms. Davis, the voice of Marcus, my building concierge, crackled through the small speaker. "I apologize for disturbing you on a day like today." "What is it, Marcus?" "A courier just arrived at the front desk," Marcus said, his tone carrying a note of polite confusion. "He dropped off a formal notice for you. It requires your signature, but I thought you should know the contents immediately. It is a dispatch from Vanguard Security Solutions." I frowned, leaning closer to the plastic speaker. Vanguard was a private contracting firm often used by elite corporate clients. Why are they sending me a notice? "The courier said it pertains to your secondary residence," Marcus replied. "The paperwork states that by order of the primary estate trustee, they are currently on site at the Cape Cod property. They are replacing all the exterior locks and installing a new perimeter system effective immediately." My blood ran cold. Thomas was not just playing a legal game. He was securing the physical perimeter. He knew my laptop was inside that house. He knew my clothes, my files, and my access to Harrison's private study were all behind those cedar-shingled walls. He was locking me out of my own sanctuary while I was busy reading his forged PDF in Boston. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Refuse the signature. Tell the courier I am not in the building." I released the button and turned back to the living room. The brown envelope sat on the glass desk, the compass rose seal gleaming in the dim light. It held Harrison's final directive, perhaps the key to untangling this entire nightmare. But a map is useless if the enemy burns down the destination before you arrive. If Vanguard finished installing those locks, my encrypted hard drive would be trapped inside, and my proof of the forgery would be lost forever. I left the envelope untouched on the glass surface. I grabbed my wet wool coat, shoved my phone into my pocket, and sprinted out the front door. The drive to the Cape took 90 minutes on a clear day. I had to get there before the deadbolts clicked shut. The tires of my sedan chewed the rain-slicked asphalt of Route 3. The 90-minute journey from Boston down to the coast stretched into a grueling eternity. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, my mind calculating variables faster than the windshield wipers could clear the glass. Harrison had always considered the coastal property our sanctuary. The salt air usually calmed my nerves, washing away the stress of corporate audits and crowded city streets. Today, the gray sky felt oppressive, mirroring the hostile takeover occurring within my own family. Turning onto the familiar crushed shell driveway, the violation became instantly visible. A stark white transit vehicle sat parked at an aggressive angle, blocking the path to the detached garage. The bold black lettering on the side panels announced Vanguard Security Solutions. My pulse quickened against my throat. Thomas had moved with terrifying speed, deploying corporate contractors to secure a private residence. I threw my car into park, deliberately cutting off any potential escape route for the van, and stepped out into the biting wind. Approaching the front porch, the destruction hit me like a physical blow. The heavy oak entrance door had guarded my grandfather's secrets for half a century. The solid brass doorknob, a fixture I had meticulously polished every spring since childhood, was gone. It had been brutally extracted. Splinters of ancient wood littered the welcome mat, exposing the raw timber beneath the varnish. In its place protruded a sleek, matte black digital keypad. A small crimson indicator light pulsed rhythmically on the device, mocking my arrival. A man wearing a tactical windbreaker stepped out from the shadow of the portico. He planted his heavy boots shoulder-width apart, crossing thick arms over his chest to project dominance. "The property is currently closed to unauthorized personnel," he grunted, a metal clipboard resting against his hip. Before I could dismantle his legal standing, the ruined door swung inward. Clara stepped over the threshold. My brother's wife epitomized inherited wealth. Her ash-blonde hair remained perfectly smooth despite the coastal humidity, shielded by a cashmere trench coat that cost more than a semester of college tuition. In her manicured hands, she cradled an object that made my stomach violently twist. It was Harrison's antique maritime chronometer, a rare 18th century clock he kept centered on his private mantel. Clara offered a smile, containing zero warmth. "Kaylee," she crooned, her voice dripping with artificial pity, "you should not be here. We are merely clearing out the clutter. The house needs staging for the upcoming real estate market. I will have the moving crew box up those cheap trinkets in your guest bedroom and ship them to your apartment. You have been so highly emotional lately. Preston thought it best we handle the heavy lifting." The sheer audacity suffocated the air around me. Looting a priceless family heirloom while categorizing my personal belongings as garbage was a calculated psychological strike. A lesser opponent would have shrieked, demanded the chronometer back, or physically charged up the wooden stairs. Screaming only validates their narrative regarding my supposed instability. I reached deep into my coat pocket. My fingertips brushed against the jagged teeth of the original brass key. It was currently useless for unlocking the disfigured entrance, but discarding it felt akin to surrendering. I quietly withdrew the cold metal from my jacket and slid it into my leather purse, letting the object settle safely at the bottom. I would not throw away the tools Harrison had given me. I pulled my smartphone from my blazer. I refused to speak to Clara. I raised the camera lens. A sharp click captured a high-resolution image of the Vanguard security van illegally blocking the property line. Another click documented the splintered door frame and the newly installed electronic deadbolt. A final crystal-clear photograph caught my sister-in-law grasping a highly valuable estate asset long before any probate paperwork had been legally processed or filed with the county clerk. Her synthetic smile fractured instantly. Clara took a rapid half-step backward, clutching the chronometer tightly against her expensive lapel. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her polite facade cracking to reveal the anxious socialite underneath. "Stop taking pictures immediately." I turned my attention exclusively toward the contractor in the windbreaker. "My name is Kaylee Davis," I stated, pitching my voice to carry absolute authority over the howling wind. "I am a legal resident of this address. My banking statements, voter registration, and federal tax returns are delivered directly to that mailbox at the end of the driveway. Under Massachusetts state law, altering the locks on a recognized tenant without a formal eviction notice signed by a sitting judge is a criminal offense." The man shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting between my unwavering gaze and Clara's rising panic. Private security contractors fear liability above all else. They are compensated to intimidate ignorant trespassers, not to absorb expensive lawsuits for executing illegal evictions against residents who know the penal code. I tapped the glass screen of my phone, dialing the local municipal precinct. I kept the speakerphone engaged so the contractor could hear the rhythmic ringing. "I am currently reporting an unlawful residential lockout in progress," I informed the dispatch officer in a calm, measured tone. "I require a patrol unit at this location immediately to document the denial of entry and the potential theft of estate property by unauthorized individuals." Clara gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. "You are calling the police on your own family?" she hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. "Thomas will destroy you for this." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The dispatcher had confirmed a cruiser was en route merely 3 minutes away. Clara's face drained of all color, realizing her country club intimidation tactics had failed entirely against statutory law. The guard took a step back, lowering his arms, silently communicating his refusal to intervene physically. But my victory felt incredibly hollow. The real prize was not gaining entry to the foyer or forcing Clara to retreat. My eyes tracked past her shoulder, peering into the dim hallway beyond the open entrance. Burly men in matching uniforms were already hauling sealed cardboard boxes down the main staircase. The race to the study had begun. Harrison kept his financial history buried deep inside the walls of this home. I knew my encrypted hard drive, the machine containing the unalterable truth of his empire, was the true target they were hunting. The police arriving would only buy me a narrow, fragile window to secure the digital evidence before the house was stripped completely bare. If Thomas found that computer before I did, the forged trust amendment would become unbreakable law. My name had not been crossed out, it had been deleted entirely. The margins of the heavy cream paper were perfectly justified to hide the space where I used to exist. I stood in the stone vestibule of the cathedral in Back Bay, Boston. The November rain battered the stained glass windows, and the air inside carried the dense scent of wet wool, burning wax, and lilies. I held the funeral program in my gloved hand, my thumb tracing the embossed lettering. Thomas Davis, Evelyn Davis, Preston Davis. The ink listed the surviving family of Harrison Davis, founder of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. I was 34 years old. I shared his last name, and I had eaten Sunday breakfast with him every week for a decade. According to this piece of expensive cardstock, I was a ghost. You need to step outside. The voice belonged to my father, Thomas. He materialized from the shadows of the arched doorway, his broad frame blocking my line of sight to the altar. He wore a tailored, charcoal morning suit, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a hard line. I looked up from the program, maintaining a level gaze. My seat is usually in the second row, Thomas. Your seat is gone, he whispered. His tone dropped to a sharp, controlled register designed not to carry. We cannot afford any disruptions today. This service requires a pristine family image. You were never really part of this family, Kaylee. You are an auditor who happened to share a dinner table. Now leave before I have the ushers remove you. My profession relies on spotting discrepancies in ledgers and reading behavioral anomalies in corporate boardrooms. Panic usually hides behind bluster. I did not argue. I did not let my voice shake. Instead, my gaze drifted past his tense shoulder. A few feet away, near the velvet rope securing the front pews, my mother, Evelyn, stood adjusting my brother Preston's silk tie. She smoothed the lapel of his custom suit and leaned in close. Chin up, Evelyn murmured, her voice cutting through the low, mournful hum of the organ. The buyers are sitting in the third row. Look the part. Buyers. The word snagged in my mind like a torn thread. Harrison's heart had stopped 3 days ago. A funeral was a space for grief, not acquisition. Yet Preston stood there looking less like a mourning grandson and more like a hedge fund manager preparing for a hostile takeover. I looked back at my father. The hostility in his eyes was a familiar fixture of my childhood, but the tight, frantic energy radiating from him was entirely new. He wasn't just embarrassed by my presence. He was terrified of me crossing that threshold. Creating a scene here would only give Evelyn the ammunition she needed to paint me as the unstable daughter. Logic dictated a strategic retreat. I folded the heavy cream program, slipped it into the pocket of my coat, and pivoted toward the exit. Before my hand reached the cold brass handle, the heavy oak doors swung open from the outside, letting in a bitter gust of Massachusetts wind. Julian Sterling stood in the threshold. He was Harrison's private corporate counsel, a man who billed by the minute, despised small talk, and rarely left his high-rise corner office. His trench coat was soaked, and he was breathing hard. Thomas immediately stepped forward, painting on a polished, grieving executive's smile. Julian, thank you for coming. We have a seat reserved for you down front. Sterling ignored him. He walked straight past my father, his wet shoes squeaking against the marble floor, and stopped inches from me. He reached inside his leather satchel and extracted a thick manila envelope. My eyes dropped to the closure. It wasn't sealed with standard legal tape. A heavy stamp of red wax secured the flap, bearing the deep impression of a compass rose. Ms. Davis Sterling, said his voice, echoing in the quiet stone vestibule. He held the envelope out, bypassing the family entirely. Your grandfather left strict instructions. This is yours. The flashing blue lights of the local municipal cruiser painted the wet cedar shingles of the estate. 2 uniformed officers stepped out into the freezing rain, their boots crunching over the white shell driveway. I presented my Massachusetts driver license. The plastic card clearly displayed the Cape Cod address. The older officer examined the credential, turned toward the Vanguard contractor, and delivered a swift lecture on the boundaries of civil tenancy disputes. The guard folded his arms and stepped aside. The police granted me exactly 10 minutes to retrieve my personal hardware. I crossed the threshold into my childhood sanctuary. The interior felt unrecognizable. The quiet refuge where my grandfather used to read maritime history had been transformed into a frantic staging ground for plunder. Hired movers navigated the wide foyer, carrying heavy wooden crates and wrapping delicate porcelain vases in layers of thick bubble wrap. My father stood near the center of the living room, barking harsh commands at a pair of men dismantling a crystal chandelier. He was stripping the estate of liquid assets before the ink on his forged document could even dry. I ignored the theft of the expensive artwork. Vases and chandeliers possessed a fixed monetary value, making them easily replaceable in a court of law. I needed the data. I turned my back on the chaos and moved down the narrow hallway toward the rear of the house. Harrison Davis conducted his shipping empire from a secluded room overlooking the gray ocean. We called it the Nerve Center. He trusted physical paper and encrypted drives over corporate servers. I pushed the heavy oak door open and froze. The study had been gutted. The Persian rug, normally pristine, was bunched up near the corner, stained with muddy footprints. The velvet curtains were torn from their brass rods pooling on the hardwood floor. A large maritime oil painting depicting a 19th century schooner had been ripped from the wall and discarded onto a leather armchair. Behind the painting, the steel door of a hidden wall safe hung wide open. The interior vault was empty. My eyes swept the room, cataloging the destruction with clinical precision. They were searching for something specific. A common thief seeks jewelry or cash. A desperate executive hunts for the corporate paper trail. I walked toward the massive mahogany desk positioned in the center of the room. My silver laptop rested near the edge, shoved carelessly aside, resting precariously close to spilling onto the floor. I exhaled a slow breath, reaching out to secure the aluminum device. The forensic accounting software and the digital tax backups were safe. Then I looked at the center of the wooden desk. A thick layer of fine gray dust coated the polished mahogany surface, except for one pristine, unblemished, rectangular void. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. I knew exactly what used to occupy that clean, geometric space. Harrison kept a heavy leather-bound master ledger stationed precisely in the middle of his workspace. It was an archaic accounting method, a habit formed decades ago before computers ruled the financial sector. Inside those worn leather pages, my grandfather chronicled the foundational architecture of Atlantic maritime logistics. That book contained the original Articles of Incorporation, private shareholder agreements, and the unredacted truth behind every transaction the company ever executed. The forged trust amendment gave my father control of the public-facing assets, but that missing ledger held the keys to the invisible corporate structure. Whoever possessed that leather-bound book controlled the true legacy. I snapped the laptop shut and slid the machine into my leather briefcase. The brass latches clicked, echoing in the ruined sanctuary. "Put the bag down, Kaylee." I turned around. Thomas stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking my only exit. The polished mourning facade he wore at the cathedral was gone. The calculated corporate persona had vanished. His features were stretched taut, revealing the raw, desperate panic underneath. He stared at the briefcase in my hand with hungry, narrowed eyes. "That computer belongs to Atlantic Maritime," my father stated, his tone flat and demanding. "It contains sensitive corporate data. You have been terminated from your advisory role. Leave the hardware on the desk and walk out the front door." He took a slow step forward, invading the confined space. I tightened my grip on the leather handle. The auditor inside me analyzed his physical posturing. He was trying to use his physical size to force compliance, an intimidation tactic he had utilized to control my mother and my brother for decades. But I was not a dependent relative seeking his approval. "This is my personal property, Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice chillingly calm. The purchase receipt is registered under my individual name, not a corporate expense account. If you believe proprietary files exist on this hard drive, your legal team can file a formal subpoena through the proper judicial channels." My father sneered, displaying a flash of white teeth. "Do not quote procedural law to me in my own house. You will not walk out of this room with that machine. Give it to me, now." He stepped closer, reaching out to grab the leather strap of my bag. I did not retreat. I held my ground and raised my voice just enough to project down the hallway. "Officer," I called out, ensuring my tone sounded clear and authoritative rather than frightened. The heavy footsteps of the municipal patrolman echoed against the hardwood floor of the corridor. The officer appeared behind Thomas, resting a casual hand on his utility belt. "Is there a problem in here?" the policeman asked, his gaze drifting from my father's outstretched arm to the ransacked condition of the study. "No problem, officer," I answered smoothly, looking directly into my father's furious eyes. "Mr. Davis was just helping me locate the exit. I have secured my personal belongings, and I am ready to depart." Thomas slowly lowered his arm, his jaw clenching so tight the bone seemed ready to fracture. He could not risk a physical altercation in front of a uniformed witness, not while he was busy orchestrating an illegal asset liquidation in the adjacent room. He stepped aside, leaving a narrow gap for me to pass. As I walked through the doorway, Thomas leaned in close, his breath brushing against my ear. "This changes nothing," he whispered, his voice vibrating with venom. "You are outmatched. I will make sure you have nowhere left to run." I did not dignify his threat with a response. I walked down the long corridor past the movers carrying out wrapped paintings and stepped out onto the wet porch. The freezing rain had subsided into a dense gray mist. I marched to my sedan, tossed the heavy briefcase onto the passenger seat, and climbed behind the steering wheel. I locked the doors immediately, letting out a long, ragged exhale. I had secured the digital evidence. The timeline of the forged trust amendment was safe inside the encrypted folders of my hard drive. But the victory felt incredibly fragile. The master ledger was gone, meaning Thomas possessed half the map. The race to untangle the corporate truth had escalated from a sprint into a marathon. I shifted the car into drive and navigated carefully down the winding coastal roads, heading back toward the highway that would carry me to Boston. The heater blasted warm air over my damp clothes, slowly returning sensation to my freezing fingers. I needed a strategy. I needed to analyze the tax returns against the routing numbers Julian Sterling had given me in the sealed envelope. My smartphone vibrated inside the cup holder, shattering the quiet hum of the engine. I glanced at the illuminated screen. The caller identification did not display a number from my family. It displayed the main switchboard for the elite Boston accounting firm where I served as a senior auditor. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was supposed to be utilizing approved bereavement leave. A call from the corporate switchboard during a funeral absence was highly irregular. I tapped the speaker button. "Kaylee Davis speaking," I answered, maintaining a professional cadence. Kaylee, a crisp voice responded. It was Richard Sterling, the managing partner of the firm, and a man who valued billable hours above human compassion. "Hello, Richard. I am currently driving back from the coast. How can I assist you? We have a situation that requires your immediate presence in the city." Richard stated, his tone devoid of its usual collegial warmth. It sounded bureaucratic and rehearsed. "A formal complaint has been registered with Human Resources regarding your recent conduct with a major client. We are convening an emergency disciplinary panel. You are summoned to the boardroom at 4 o'clock today." A cold chill radiated down my spine, far colder than the ocean wind outside. My father had promised to ruin my career, and he moved with terrifying efficiency. The smear campaign had officially breached the walls of my professional life, threatening to sever my only remaining source of independence. "I will be there," I said, disconnecting the call. The highway stretched out before me, gray and unforgiving. The battle for my grandfather's legacy was no longer confined to forged wills and stolen ledgers. It had just infected my livelihood, forcing me into a corner where surrender seemed like the only logical option. The drive back to Boston offered zero comfort. The gray skyline of the city mirrored the cold reality waiting for me at the auditing firm. I pulled my sedan into the underground parking garage of the glass tower where I had spent the last 7 years building a flawless professional record. I navigated the elevator up to the 40th floor. The polished marble lobby usually felt like a second home, a place of logic and predictable numbers. Today, the pristine environment felt like a holding cell. Before heading to the designated boardroom, I stopped at my personal desk to drop off my damp coat. I tapped the spacebar on my keyboard to wake the dual monitors. My corporate email inbox displayed a dozen unread messages. One subject line caught my immediate attention. It was forwarded by Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer of a logistics company I personally audited. Marcus was an influential client, a man who valued discretion above all else. The forwarded message originated from my mother. I clicked the email, my eyes scanning the elegant cursive font Evelyn favored for her digital correspondence. The message was addressed to the steering committee of her elite country club, a list that included the wives of Boston's most powerful corporate directors. The text was a masterpiece of engineered character assassination. "Dearest friends," Evelyn had written, "I ask for your prayers during this dark chapter. As we mourn the passing of Harrison, our family is facing a secondary tragedy. My daughter Kaylee is suffering a severe mental break. The grief has fractured her grasp on reality. She is attempting to extort her grieving father and brother for financial gain, demanding assets that do not belong to her. Please excuse any erratic behavior or desperate phone calls you might receive from her office. We are seeking psychiatric help for her condition." My stomach turned. Evelyn was not just spreading gossip over tea. She was systematically detonating my professional credibility across the entire metropolitan area. In my industry, reputation serves as the only currency that matters. An auditor who appears unstable, greedy, or desperate is a liability no corporation will tolerate. My mother had planted a seed of doubt so toxic that my signature on a financial document was now practically worthless. I printed a hard copy of the email, folded the crisp paper, and walked down the quiet corridor toward the executive boardroom. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table. A representative from Human Resources sat to his right, her hands folded neatly over a blank yellow legal pad. Richard did not offer a polite greeting or ask about the funeral. He gestured to the empty leather chair positioned directly across from him. "Have a seat," Kaylee Richard instructed. His voice carried the precise neutral tone he utilized when delivering bad news to underperforming shareholders. I sat down, keeping my posture straight and my hands resting on the table. "I am here, Richard. Let us address this human resources complaint." Richard steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on a printed document resting before him. "Less than an hour ago, our firm received a formal communication from the executive board of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. Your father, Thomas Davis, informed us that retaining your services as a senior auditor represents a severe conflict of interest for their enterprise." I kept my expression blank, refusing to let him see the sting. "Atlantic Maritime is not a client of this firm, Richard. My family disputes have zero bearing on my ability to audit external accounts." Richard sighed, a brief flicker of genuine regret breaking through his corporate armor. "Thomas Davis also serves on the advisory board for Vanguard Holdings," Richard replied. "Vanguard represents 12% of our annual billing revenue. Thomas made it exceedingly clear that if you remain employed here, Vanguard will terminate their contract with us by the end of the business day. He cited an ongoing family legal dispute and raised serious concerns regarding your ethical stability." The strategy was flawless. Thomas had weaponized his vast network to suffocate me. He knew I had the digital backups on my laptop. He knew I could prove the trust amendment was forged. But pursuing a legal battle against billionaires requires massive capital. By threatening the firm's bottom line, he was severing my financial lifeline. He intended to starve me out before I could ever reach a courtroom. "You are allowing an external executive to dictate your internal personnel decisions based on unsubstantiated slander." I stated, my voice steady, though my pulse drummed a rapid rhythm against my ribs. I slid the printed email from Evelyn across the polished wood. "My family is coordinating a targeted defamation campaign to prevent me from exposing a fraudulent estate transfer. This is extortion." Richard glanced at the paper, reading my mother's toxic words. He did not look surprised. He just looked tired. "I believe you, Kaylee," Richard said quietly, pushing the paper back toward me. "You are the most meticulous auditor in this building, but we are not a law enforcement agency. We are a business. We cannot risk a lucrative account over a private inheritance feud. Effective immediately, you are placed on an indefinite, unpaid suspension pending a formal internal review." The words hung in the sterile air of the boardroom. Unpaid suspension. It was a corporate death sentence. I lost my salary. I lost my health insurance. I lost my standing in the financial community. My father had reached into my independent life and crushed it with a single phone call. The human resources representative slid a gray plastic bin across the table. "We need your access badge, your corporate credit card, and your office keys," she recited, her tone robotic and rehearsed. "Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items." I unclipped the plastic badge from my lapel and placed it into the bin. I surrendered the items one by one. I did not cry. I did not plead for my job. Pleading implies the executioner possesses a conscience. I gathered my pride, stood up from the leather chair, and walked out of the room. An hour later, I stood alone in the center of my dark apartment in the Seaport District. The rain continued to beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city lights into smeared streaks of yellow and white. A single cardboard box rested on the hardwood floor near my feet. It contained a few framed photographs, my favorite pens, and a ceramic coffee mug, the meager spoils of a 7-year career. The silence in the room felt heavy, wrapping around my throat. The reality of my isolation settled over my shoulders. My family had successfully stripped me of my inheritance, my physical sanctuary in Cape Cod, my professional reputation, and my financial independence. They held all the cards. They possessed the stolen master ledger, the forged legal documents, and the bottomless bank accounts required to maintain the lie. I walked over to the glass desk and sat down. I stared at the blank wall, feeling the distinct, bitter taste of defeat. The adrenaline that had driven me through the day slowly ebbed away, leaving behind a cold, dangerous lull. The chessboard was nearly empty, and my king was cornered. I reached out and clicked the switch on my brass desk lamp. A warm circle of light illuminated the glass surface, pushing back the shadows in the room. Resting directly in the center of that light was the thick brown envelope Julian Sterling had handed me in the church vestibule. Thomas and Preston believed they had neutralized the threat. They believed my lack of resources rendered me powerless. But an auditor knows the true value of an asset is rarely visible on the surface. My grandfather had orchestrated this delivery with extreme prejudice. He knew his son was a predator. He knew my brother was a parasite. He knew they would try to erase me from the equation. I picked up the heavy paper package. The red wax seal bearing the sharp points of the compass rose felt cool against my fingertips. I did not need a salary or a corporate badge to read the truth. I slid my thumbnail under the edge of the hardened wax. With a sharp, satisfying crack, the seal broke apart, exposing the hidden architecture of Harrison Davis's final defense. I pulled the stack of documents from the envelope, unfolding the thick parchment, ready to discover the weapon my grandfather had left behind. I slid the thick stack of parchment from the envelope. The paper felt heavy, bearing the distinct texture of premium legal stock. A small, square yellow sticky note clung to the top page, written in faded black ink. My breath hitched in my throat. I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. "Numbers do not have egos, Kaylee. When people lie, the math tells the truth. Look deeper." The scent of the old paper transported me backwards in time. I closed my eyes, letting the memory pull me away from the cold reality of my Boston apartment. I was 12 years old again, sitting on the wraparound cedar porch of the Cape Cod house. The August sun beat down on the wooden deck, warming my bare feet. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against the rocky shoreline in a rhythmic, soothing pattern. Harrison sat beside me in his favorite wicker chair, wearing a faded canvas sailing jacket. He held a thick binder filled with complex financial spreadsheets. Most grandfathers took their granddaughters out for ice cream or taught them how to ride a bicycle. Harrison taught me how to read a profit and loss statement. He placed a column of numbers in front of me, tapping the paper with the blunt end of his silver fountain pen. He explained how revenue streams worked, how to calculate operating margins, and how to spot concealed liabilities. I remember furrowing my brow, trying to memorize the formulas. He noticed my frustration, gently placing his rough, calloused hand over mine. "People will always try to sell you a story, kiddo," Harrison had said, his voice rumbling like a ship engine. "They will dress it up in expensive suits, they will use polite manners, and they will try to make you doubt your own eyes. But the math never cares about their feelings. The math is immune to charm. If the columns do not balance, the story is a fiction." I opened my eyes, the memory fading into the quiet shadows of my living room. Harrison had spent his entire life preparing me for this exact moment. He knew his son Thomas operated on ego and deceit. He armed me with the only weapon capable of cutting through their illusions. I peeled the sticky note off the parchment and pressed it onto the edge of my glass desk. I began reading the legal text. The documents did not contain a traditional will or a list of bank account balances. They revealed a ghost structure. 2 years prior to his death, Harrison had secretly executed a massive corporate reorganization. He recognized the threat Thomas posed to the shipping empire. To protect the company from his own son, Harrison transferred the entirety of Atlantic Maritime Logistics into a blind trust, effectively severing the corporate assets from his personal estate. The forged trust amendment Preston sent me only applied to the personal estate. Thomas had successfully stolen the Cape Cod property and the liquid cash accounts. But he did not own the ships. He did not own the ports. He did not own the international contracts. I flipped to the final page of the stack. A pristine, notarized corporate proxy stared back at me. The document bore Harrison's authentic signature, witnessed and stamped by Julian Sterling. The text was unambiguous. Harrison had named me the irrevocable majority shareholder and the sole managing director of the holding company. I held 60% of the voting stock. I possessed the legal authority to fire the entire executive board, liquidate the fleet, or shut down the headquarters. A surge of adrenaline raced through my veins. I held the power to ruin the men who had just orchestrated my professional destruction. I could walk into the boardroom and strip them of their titles. But as an auditor, I am trained to look for the catch. I read the fine print at the bottom of the proxy page. The authority granted within this proxy remains dormant and legally unenforceable until authenticated alongside the original articles of incorporation. My heart sank, the initial rush of victory dissolving into cold dread. The proxy was just a map. It required a key to unlock the vault. The original articles of incorporation were not filed in a public registry. Harrison kept those foundational documents strictly private, housing them exclusively within the heavy, leather-bound master ledger, the same ledger Thomas had stolen from the Cape Cod study just hours ago. I had the legal mechanism to win the war, but the enemy held the ammunition. If I walked into a courtroom with just the proxy, Thomas would deploy his expensive legal team to delay the verification process for years. They would demand the original articles. Without the ledger, a judge would dismiss my claim, and Thomas would maintain control of the company operations during the endless appeals. I needed that leather-bound book. I opened my silver laptop, the machine I had rescued from the ransacked coastal property. I typed my password, accessing the encrypted hard drive. If Thomas possessed the ledger, he would be using it to map out the corporate accounts. He needed to understand the financial architecture before he could liquidate the assets. I pulled up the digital tax backups from the previous 3 fiscal years. I cross-referenced the complex webs of corporate expenditures with a list of routing numbers printed on the last page of Sterling's file. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing commands and generating pivot tables. The glowing numbers reflected off my eyes as I built a timeline of recent transactions. The columns began to tell a story. Thomas and Preston were moving capital, but they were encountering blockades. Several large transfers initiated from the corporate operating accounts had bounced back over the last 48 hours. They were hitting authorization walls. The blind trust structure was actively resisting their commands. This meant They had not destroyed the master ledger. They could not burn it. They needed the historical account codes and the incorporation clauses to bypass the banking restrictions. They were keeping the book safe while they attempted to decipher Harrison's complex financial web. I narrowed my search parameters. I focused on personal expenditures, searching for any unusual financial activity linked to my parents within the last week. If they were hiding the most valuable book in Massachusetts, they would require a secure location. A strange recurring payment caught my attention. It was a monthly charge initiated 2 years ago, billed to a corporate shell company registered under Evelyn's maiden name. The payments went to a high-security commercial storage facility located on the industrial outskirts of Boston. They were not keeping the ledger at the Cape Cod estate. They were not keeping it at their primary residence in the city. They were storing their stolen assets in a climate-controlled vault miles away from their manicured neighborhood. I highlighted the address of the storage facility. I memorized the unit number and the billing cycle dates. The path forward crystallized in my mind. I needed to infiltrate that industrial complex and extract the ledger before Thomas figured out how to unlock the corporate bank accounts. I reached for a pen, intending to sketch a floor plan of the facility based on the public building records. Before the ink touched the paper, a sudden, frantic pounding erupted at my front door. The sharp noise shattered the quiet isolation of my apartment. The knocking was not the polite, measured tap of a concierge or a delivery driver. It was desperate, rhythmic, and loud enough to rattle the door frame. I froze my hand hovering over the desk. My father had already severed my employment and locked me out of my childhood home. He had no reason to send an intimidation squad to my residence. He believed I was defeated. The pounding resumed, followed by a muffled, pleading voice calling my name through the thick wood. I stood up, walked softly across the hardwood floor, and peered through the small glass peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Clara. My brother's wife looked nothing like the polished socialite who had sneered at me on the Cape Cod porch just hours earlier. Her expensive cashmere coat was soaked with rain. Her blonde hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face. Her makeup was smeared, tracing dark lines down her pale cheeks. She was shivering, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield. She raised her fist and pounded on the door again, her eyes darting nervously down the empty corridor. "Kaylee, please," Clara called out, her voice cracking with apparent panic. "Please open the door. You have to let me in. They do not know I am here." I stepped back from the door, my mind analyzing the unexpected variable. Clara was a loyal foot soldier for Preston. She prioritized wealth and social standing above all other metrics. Defecting from the family right as they assumed control of a billionaire estate made zero logical sense. The math did not balance. The story was a fiction. I placed my hand on the deadbolt, preparing to engage the enemy on my own territory. I turned the lock, the heavy metal cylinder sliding back with a loud click, and pulled the door open to face the storm she brought with her. I pulled the heavy wooden door inward. The corridor light spilled into my darkened entryway, illuminating the shivering figure standing on my welcome mat. Clara crossed the threshold before I could offer a formal invitation. She brought the scent of wet asphalt, rain-soaked wool, and expensive floral perfume into my sterile apartment. Water dripped from the hem of her ruined cashmere coat, pooling on the polished hardwood floor. She wrapped her arms around her torso, her teeth chattering. It was a stark departure from the poised, untouchable socialite who had mocked me outside the coastal estate just hours prior. I closed the door, securing the deadbolt. The metallic slide echoed in the quiet room. "I came straight here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, avoiding my eyes. "I left the house in the middle of dinner. I could not sit across from him for another second." I did not ask who she meant. I walked toward the open kitchen area, gesturing for her to follow. My bones felt heavy, weighed down by the relentless sequence of betrayals. The funeral exclusion, the forged trust amendment, the physical lockout, the calculated destruction of my career. A dangerous, intoxicating wave of exhaustion washed over me. For a fleeting second, a vulnerable part of my brain wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the rot had not infected everyone, that someone inside that family recognized the profound injustice unfolding. "Sit down," I instructed, pointing to a leather bar stool at the kitchen island. I turned my back to her, reaching into the overhead cabinet for a ceramic mug. I poured hot black coffee from the carafe, the dark liquid steaming in the cool air of the apartment. I needed the mundane physical action to ground my thoughts. When I turned back around, Clara had buried her face in her manicured hands. Soft, jagged sobs shook her narrow shoulders. I placed the warm mug near her elbow. She reached for it, wrapping her pale fingers around the ceramic surface as if drawing life from the heat. "Preston has lost his mind." Kaylee Clara wept, staring into the dark liquid. "He and Thomas are acting like scavengers. The way they spoke about you tonight, the things they are planning to do with the company, it frightened me. I married a man who enjoyed luxury, not a man capable of this level of cruelty. My marriage is falling apart in real time." She lifted her head, meeting my gaze. Her mascara was smeared, tracing faint gray shadows down her cheeks. The tears looked genuine. The fear sounded authentic. She reached across the marble counter, her fingers brushing against my wrist. "When they called your auditing firm this afternoon," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "when Thomas bragged over the dinner table about getting you suspended, I felt sick to my stomach. It is too much. You are his daughter. You do not deserve this. I want to help you fight them." My pulse settled into a slow, rhythmic beat. I looked at her hand resting on my arm. The tactile sensation mirrored Evelyn standing in the church vestibule, feigning maternal concern to extract compliance. An auditor survives by identifying behavioral anomalies. Human beings leak information through their choices, their phrasing, and their physical tells. Clara had just made a critical error. Thomas orchestrating my suspension was a fresh, highly classified corporate maneuver. My father utilized his leverage with Vanguard Holdings less than 4 hours ago. He would never broadcast a federal extortion scheme over a casual family dinner while the estate assets remained unsecured. Men like Thomas silo their illegal activities. They do not brag to their daughters-in-law about blackmailing elite accounting firms. Clara knew about my suspension because she was sitting in the strategic planning meetings. The flicker of hope in my chest extinguished, replaced by a glacier of pure, calculated logic. I did not pull my arm away. I allowed her to stroke my wrist, offering her the illusion of comfort. "Thank you for telling me, Clara," I said, keeping my tone soft, injecting a slight manufactured quaver into my vocal cords. "I feel like the ground is vanishing beneath my feet. I do not even know where to begin." Clara squeezed my arm, her posture shifting subtly. She leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. The weeping subsided, replaced by an intense, focused energy. "We can stop them," Clara urged, her eyes wide. "But I need to know what we are working with." When Julian Sterling walked into the cathedral, Thomas panicked. He is terrified of whatever was inside that brown envelope. As she spoke, her gaze drifted past my shoulder. I watched her pupils track the geometry of my living room. Her eyes landed on the glass desk positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The desk where I had left the broken red wax seal, the torn manila paper, and the thick stack of premium legal parchment outlining the corporate proxy. She stared at the documents. The calculation in her expression was unmistakable. She was weighing the legal threat, evaluating the paper like a hostile buyer assessing a distressed property. "What did Sterling give you, Kaylee?" she asked, her voice tightening with poorly concealed urgency. "Did Harrison leave you the liquid cash? Did he leave you the voting shares? Tell me what your next legal move is, and I will help you hire the right litigators to destroy Preston." The Trojan horse was fully deployed inside my walls. Clara had not driven through a storm to seek refuge from a crumbling marriage. Thomas and Preston had sent her. They were flying blind. They knew Harrison delivered a weapon, but they lacked the intelligence to identify the caliber. They needed to know if I possessed the actual corporate proxy, and more importantly, they needed to know if I realized the master ledger was missing. Clara was a spy, dispatched to map my armory. The betrayal did not spark anger. Anger is a volatile, unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment. I felt nothing but ice. I looked at the woman sitting at my kitchen counter, a woman willing to weaponize my grief to secure her own unearned wealth. If I threw her out of my apartment, I would confirm their worst fears. I would signal my strength, forcing Thomas to accelerate the liquidation of the Maritime Holding Company. I needed to slow them down. I needed them to feel arrogant, complacent, and victorious. I had to feed the spy a narrative that would send my father chasing shadows. I let my shoulders slump, physically collapsing under the weight of an invisible burden. I pulled my wrist out of her grasp and covered my face with both hands. I drew a deep, ragged breath, pulling the genuine sorrow I felt for Harrison up into my throat. When I lowered my hands, real tears pooled in the corners of my eyes. Sterling gave me nothing useful. "Clara," I lied, my voice cracking perfectly on the final syllable. Clara blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" It was a formal directive from his private counsel. I shook my head, walking over to the glass desk. I placed my hands flat on the smooth surface, deliberately covering the corporate proxy with my forearms. "It is just a sentimental letter," I continued, letting a sob break through my words. Harrison wrote a long letter apologizing for the state of the family. He left me a small life insurance policy to cover my living expenses. There are no voting shares. There is no hidden corporate mechanism. Thomas and Preston won. They took the trust and they took the company. I watched her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The tension drained from her shoulders. The panicked spy vanished, replaced by the relieved socialite who realized her bank accounts were safe. "But I am not letting them take the house," I declared, raising my voice to project sudden irrational desperation. "That Cape Cod property belongs to me. Harrison promised me that sanctuary." I turned around, staring at her with wide, manic eyes. "I am taking the life insurance money and hiring a civil litigation firm tomorrow morning. I am going to file an injunction against the real estate transfer. I do not care how long it takes or how much it costs. I will drag Thomas through property court for the next decade if I have to." Clara stared at me, processing the fabricated intelligence. I had just handed her exactly what she came to find. A defeated adversary possessing zero corporate leverage, obsessively focused on a singular, irrelevant piece of residential real estate. "You should fight for the house, Kaylee," Clara agreed smoothly, her fake sympathy returning. "You deserve that property." She stood up from the bar stool, leaving the coffee untouched. She adjusted her damp coat, the mission accomplished. "I will keep my ears open at home," she promised, walking toward the front door. "I will call you the second Preston mentions the real estate deeds. We are in this together." I followed her into the entryway, playing the role of the grateful, naive victim until the very last second. "Thank you, Clara. You are the only family I have left." She offered a tight, pitying smile, stepped out into the corridor, and hurried toward the elevator bank. I closed the door and engaged the deadbolt. The tears evaporated instantly. I walked back to the glass desk, lifted my arms, and looked down at the authentic corporate proxy resting under the warm light of the brass lamp. I had just sent the enemy army marching in the wrong direction. The board was set, and it was time to find the stolen ledger. I walked to the expansive glass pane dominating my living room. The rain continued its relentless assault against the window, blurring the street lamps into glowing yellow orbs. I waited in the shadows, my breathing shallow and measured. Exactly 9 minutes after Clara exited my apartment, a sleek black sports utility vehicle sharply swerved to a halt near the curb below. The passenger door swung open. Even from 40 stories above the pavement, I recognized my brother's restless, impatient posture behind the steering wheel. Clara climbed inside, shielding her ruined hair with her purse. The vehicle accelerated instantly, its taillights bleeding into the wet darkness. They were rushing back to report the fabricated intelligence. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving a pale, fragile light filtering through the clouds. I had not slept. I remained seated at my desk, consuming black coffee while monitoring the digital ripples of my deception. At precisely 8 o'clock, my cellular phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Julian Sterling. I answered immediately. "Good morning, Julian," I said, keeping my tone crisp. "Your father's legal counsel just made a highly irregular maneuver," the attorney stated, skipping any pleasantries. "A senior partner from their firm contacted a property court judge at his private residence this morning. They filed a preemptive defense motion seeking to block any potential civil injunctions regarding the Cape Cod real estate. They are preparing an expensive litigation strategy to protect the physical house. They took the bait." I replied, a cold satisfaction settling over my chest. "You engineered this distraction." Sterling deduced, his gravelly voice carrying a trace of genuine respect. "You made them believe you are focused on the residential property." I fed Clara a narrative she wanted to hear. I explained. "Thomas operates on the assumption that I am emotional and sentimental. He believes I am liquidating my non-existent savings to fight for my childhood bedroom. As long as he is pouring his resources into defending the coastal estate, he is not examining the blind trust or looking for the corporate proxy. It is a brilliant tactical pivot, Kaylee. However, a distraction is only valuable if you utilize the borrowed time to secure the objective. Do you possess the location of the master ledger? I am working on the coordinates now. I promised, terminating the connection. The psychological warfare was functioning perfectly, but the physical reality remained daunting. I returned my attention to the silver laptop resting on the glass surface. The previous night, I had identified suspicious monthly payments directed to a commercial storage facility. At first glance, that industrial complex seemed like the logical hiding place for Harrison's stolen records. But my grandfather taught me never to trust the initial conclusion. I opened the encrypted folder containing his comprehensive asset manifests and insurance riders. A leather-bound book is a delicate artifact. The master ledger was not a modern binder. It was bound in 19th century calfskin and filled with highly sensitive, fragile parchment. Harrison kept it sealed inside a vintage maritime lockbox, a heavy brass and mahogany vault designed to protect nautical charts from saltwater corrosion and extreme humidity. That specific lockbox carried its own standalone insurance policy due to its historical value. I pulled the recent billing statements for the commercial storage unit. The square footage listed on the invoice was enormous. It was designed for holding bulk items, not preserving delicate artifacts. Furthermore, the facility lacked the specific climate control metrics required by the insurance underwriter. Thomas was greedy, but he was not careless with valuables. If he ruined the ledger through improper storage, he would destroy his own ability to govern the shipping empire. The unit was likely holding Evelyn's discarded luxury furniture from the Cape House, not the keys to the kingdom. I abandoned the storage facility lead and initiated a deep dive into the insurance portfolios. I cross-referenced the policy numbers with the recent digital tax backups, tracking any modifications executed within the last 72 hours. The forensic software scanned thousands of lines of code, the processor humming softly against the quiet backdrop of my apartment. A glaring red flag appeared on the screen. 48 hours ago, the exact same day Thomas forced the forged trust amendment through, someone initiated an emergency location transfer on the vintage maritime lockbox policy. The designated housing address was updated to reflect a new permanent resting place. I read the updated address, my pulse quickening. The coordinates did not point to an anonymous warehouse or a secure bank vault. The address belonged to a multi-story brick brownstone located in the exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. It was my parents' primary residential property. Thomas had not hidden the vault in a remote location. His arrogance dictated a different strategy. He believed his own fortress was the most secure structure in Massachusetts. He moved Harrison's lockbox directly into his personal home office. The master ledger, the articles of incorporation, and the undeniable proof of my executive authority were sitting behind the mahogany doors of my father's inner sanctum. The revelation presented a formidable tactical nightmare. The Beacon Hill brownstone was an architectural stronghold. Evelyn insisted on state-of-the-art perimeter alarms, motion sensors, and reinforced entryways. Infiltrating a commercial storage unit might have required a clever bluff past a minimum wage guard. Infiltrating my father's residence required a miracle. I could not simply knock on the front door and request a tour of the study. Thomas had officially declared me an exiled member of the bloodline. Any unauthorized attempt to cross his threshold would result in immediate arrest for trespassing. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, rubbing my tired eyes. I needed a legitimate reason to walk through the front gates. I needed an invitation from the predator himself. But Thomas believed I was a defeated, destitute nuisance, preparing a pathetic real estate lawsuit. He had zero incentive to grant me an audience. Unless he wanted to gloat. Men like Thomas draw sustenance from the submission of their adversaries. Winning is insufficient. They require their opponents to publicly acknowledge the defeat. If he believed my fabricated lawsuit was the last desperate gasp of a ruined daughter, he might attempt to crush it instantly with a psychological strike. A sharp chime resonated from the laptop speakers. An incoming electronic mail notification hovered in the top corner of the monitor. The sender identity displayed Thomas Davis. My breath caught. The timing was almost supernatural. I clicked the envelope icon, opening the digital correspondence. The message was brief, devoid of any familial warmth. It was drafted with the cold, sterile precision of a corporate summons. Kaylee, the current hostilities are benefiting no one. We are willing to discuss a final, amicable settlement regarding the coastal property before this escalates into a public spectacle. You are expected at the Beacon Hill residence for dinner tonight at 7 o'clock. Do not be late. I read the text 3 times, the syllables burning into my memory. It was an obvious trap. He intended to corner me in his dining room, surrounded by Evelyn and Preston, and force me to surrender my fictional lawsuit for pennies on the dollar. He wanted to break my spirit over a plate of expensive food. But he did not know I had the map. He did not know I had uncovered his forgery. And he certainly did not know I possessed the exact coordinates of the missing corporate keys. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, dangerous calm settling over my nervous system. I would walk directly into the lion's den, sit at his table, and endure whatever psychological warfare he chose to inflict. Because while he was busy trying to buy my silence, I would find a way to breach his private study and secure the master ledger. The invitation was a death sentence for my dignity, but it was the only path to the lockbox. I closed the email application, stood up from the desk, and walked toward my closet. I needed to choose my armor carefully for the evening ahead. The digital summons from my father was merely the opening salvo. Less than 30 minutes after the email arrived, the intercom in my apartment buzzed a second time. A bonded courier waited in the lobby, requiring my physical signature for a parcel. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor and signed the electronic clipboard. The courier handed me a rigid, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the flawless, sweeping loops of the handwriting instantly. The ink spelled out my full name in Evelyn's signature calligraphy. She wielded a fountain pen the way other women wielded scalps. A beautifully written note from my mother always masked a calculated threat. I opened the thick paper flap as I walked back to the elevators. Inside rested a heavy card containing the updated security passcode for the wrought iron gates of the Beacon Hill brownstone, accompanied by a single sentence confirming dinner at 7. The digital email was Thomas asserting his dominance. The courier delivery was Evelyn, ensuring I possessed the physical keys to step into their trap. They were orchestrating my surrender with the meticulous precision of a theatrical production. I returned to my apartment and prepared for the evening. When walking into a hostile negotiation, attire serves as armor. I bypassed the dark mourning clothes I had worn to the funeral. I selected a tailored, charcoal gray blazer and a crisp white silk blouse. The garments projected professionalism and unyielding structure. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight twist at the nape of my neck, eliminating any soft edges. Before leaving the bedroom, I reached into my leather purse. My fingers located the heavy, jagged profile of the antique brass key. It was the original mechanism from the Cape Cod front door the hardware Vanguard Security had rendered useless when they installed the electronic deadbolt. I slipped the cold metal into the right pocket of my blazer. The physical weight pressed against my hip, a silent reminder of the stolen sanctuary and the vintage maritime lockbox waiting inside my father's study. The drive across the city felt unnervingly brief. Beacon Hill is a neighborhood built on old money and impenetrable social hierarchies. Gas lamps illuminated the cobblestone sidewalks, casting long, wavering shadows against the historic brick facades. I parked my sedan 2 blocks away and walked the remaining distance. The crisp evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. I reached the tall iron gates of my parents' residence. I punched the newly provided numeric code into the discreet brass keypad. The heavy gate clicked open with a quiet metallic thud. I climbed the stone steps and rang the doorbell. Our longtime housekeeper opened the heavy wooden door, offering a tight, uncomfortable nod before retreating into the shadows of the hallway. I stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside felt stifling, heavily perfumed with roasted meat, expensive floral arrangements, and the underlying tension of a waiting firing squad. I walked down the corridor and entered the formal dining room. The staging was immaculate. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the antique chandelier. Sterling silver cutlery rested perfectly parallel on the linen tablecloth. Evelyn, Thomas Preston, and Clara were already seated, arranged like a corporate tribunal. As I crossed the threshold, 4 heads turned in unison. 4 shark-like smiles greeted me, their teeth gleaming in the soft, ambient light. "Kaylee, darling," Evelyn cooed, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You look so pale. Please sit down. We have been waiting for you." I took the single, empty chair positioned at the far end of the long mahogany table, physically isolated from the family unit. Clara offered me a sympathetic, tight-lipped nod, playing the role of the loyal confidant she had rehearsed in my apartment the previous night. Preston merely smirked, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a golden child who had never earned a single dollar in his bank account. Thomas sat at the head of the table. He did not look like a grieving son. He looked like an apex predator evaluating a wounded animal. "Let us begin the evening with a toast," my father announced, his tone dripping with artificial warmth. He lifted a heavy cut crystal decanter filled with a rich amber liquid. It was Harrison's prized vintage scotch, an incredibly rare batch my grandfather only opened for momentous occasions. Thomas poured a generous measure into his own glass, then passed the decanter to Preston. They were celebrating the theft of the estate using the very spoils of their crime. Thomas then reached for a dark green bottle of wine resting near his elbow. He poured a shallow measure into a plain glass and slid it down the table toward me. I looked at the dark red liquid. It was a pedestrian, cheap table wine, the kind Evelyn used exclusively for cooking reductions. The microaggression was deliberate and insulting. They were drinking the liquid legacy of a billionaire while offering me the cheapest vintage in the house to remind me of my newly impoverished status. "To family," Thomas declared, raising his crystal glass. "To family," Preston and Evelyn echoed. I did not touch my glass. I kept my hands folded in my lap, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The clinking of their crystal sounded hollow in the quiet room. Evelyn set her glass down and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the linen cloth. "It has been such a difficult week," she murmured, adopting a wistful, nostalgic cadence. "I was just looking through old photograph albums today. I found those pictures from that summer we rented the sailboat in Nantucket. Do you remember, Kaylee? You were 10 years old. You dropped your ice cream on the deck and cried for an hour until your father bought you a new one. We were so happy then. We protected you." The psychological warfare was escalating. Evelyn was weaponizing a childhood memory to fabricate a history of parental protection that never existed. She wanted to regress my mindset, treating me like a helpless 10-year-old child who needed her parents to solve her problems. "I remember Nantucket," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I also remember Harrison buying that ice cream, Evelyn, not Thomas." The fake smile on my mother's face faltered for a fraction of a second. A sharp, icy glare pierced through her maternal veneer before she quickly recovered her composure. Thomas cleared his throat, abandoning the nostalgic theater. He rested his forearms on the table, folding his hands together. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," he stated. "You are hurting Kaylee. We understand that grief makes people behave irrationally. Clara mentioned you are liquidating your savings to file a frivolous civil lawsuit regarding the Cape Cod property." I allowed my shoulders to slump slightly, dropping my gaze to the table. I let them see a defeated, exhausted woman. "You cannot win a property dispute against us," Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a low, soothing rhythm intended to sound reasonable. "You do not possess the capital to survive a protracted legal battle. Your career is currently suspended. Your reputation in the financial sector is severely compromised. If you file that injunction, you will bankrupt yourself before you even reach a preliminary hearing." He reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a folded legal document. He smoothed the crisp paper flat and slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it rested inches from my plate. "We do not want to see you destitute," Evelyn chimed in, her voice coated in synthetic honey. "We are your family. We want to provide you with a soft landing." I looked down at the document. It was a comprehensive legal waiver. The text stipulated that in exchange for permanently relinquishing any future claims to the Cape Cod real estate, the Blind Trust and the Maritime Holding Company, I would receive a singular, flat payout. I read the bold numerical figure printed at the bottom of the page, $100,000. The sum was pathetic. It was a fraction of the daily operating revenue for Atlantic Maritime Logistics. They were attempting to purchase a billion-dollar empire using pocket change, assuming my current desperation would blind me to the true value of the legacy. "All you have to do is sign the paper," Thomas urged softly. "The funds will be wired into your checking account tomorrow morning. You can drop the ridiculous lawsuit, secure your rent for the next few years, and walk away from this situation with your dignity intact." I kept my head bowed, staring at the typed numbers. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my hands tremble visibly as I reached out and touched the edge of the waiver. I channeled every ounce of grief I felt for my grandfather and projected it outward as raw, unadulterated panic. "This is all I get," I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. "It is more than you deserve," Preston scoffed from across the table, swirling the vintage scotch in his glass. "Take the money and leave us alone." I pulled my hand back from the paper, letting a single genuine tear escape my eye and roll down my cheek. I looked at the four predators surrounding me. They looked triumphant. They believed the psychological siege had broken my defenses. They believed the war was over. "I need a moment," I said, pushing my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. "My hands are shaking. I cannot sign anything right now. I need to compose myself." "Take your time, darling," Evelyn offered graciously, a victorious gleam shining in her eyes. "The powder room is just down the hall. We will keep your wine waiting for you." I turned away from the dining table and walked out into the dimly lit corridor. The second I crossed the threshold and stepped out of their line of sight, the trembling in my hands vanished completely. The tears stopped. My posture straightened. I did not walk toward the guest powder room. I turned my body silently to the left, slipping down the narrow hallway that led directly into the shadowed depths of my father's private study. The heavy brass key in my blazer pocket bumped against my hip, cold and ready. The corridor stretched before me, draped in shadows. The dining room chatter faded into a muffled murmur behind the heavy oak door. I had maybe 5 minutes before Evelyn grew suspicious and sent the housekeeper to check the powder room. My leather soles made zero sound against the thick Persian runner carpeting the hallway. I passed the guest bathroom, ignoring the glowing sconces framing its entrance. I pushed deeper into the private wing of the brownstone. The air grew colder here, separated from the ambient heat of the formal entertaining spaces. At the far end of the hall stood my father's inner sanctum. I grasped the polished silver handle of the study door. I turned it with agonizing slowness, preventing the internal latch from clicking. The hinges swung open silently. The room smelled of aged leather, stale scotch, and lemon polish. Moonlight filtered through the slatted blinds, casting pale geometric lines across the dark hardwood floor. Thomas maintained an environment of intimidating order. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves housed unread legal volumes. A sprawling mahogany desk dominated the center of the space. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, leaving a mere crack to monitor the hallway. The ambient light provided just enough illumination to navigate. I moved behind the expansive desk. My hands traced the smooth wooden edges. Thomas was a creature of predictable habits. He coveted control, preferring to keep his most valuable assets within arm's reach. He would never relegate Harrison's artifacts to a dusty attic or a basement safe. I dropped to my knees, feeling the soft wool rug beneath my legs. I ran my palms along the underside of the desk drawer panels, searching for hidden compartments. Nothing. I shifted my focus to the floor space beneath the primary seating area. Tucked deep into the darkest corner, partially concealed by a leather wastebasket, sat a square, shadow-draped object. I reached out and brushed my fingertips against cool, dense metal. I pulled the object forward. The vintage maritime lockbox emerged into a sliver of moonlight. It was a beautiful, formidable piece of 19th century craftsmanship. The exterior consisted of polished mahogany, reinforced with heavy brass corner plating. Sailors originally utilized these vaults to shield vital navigation charts from corrosive saltwater and theft. Harrison had repurposed this specific container to house the genesis of his shipping empire. The locking mechanism, situated on the front panel, was an archaic marvel. It featured no digital keypad or biometric scanner. It relied entirely on an intricate mechanical tumbler system. Thomas likely believed the vault was impenetrable without hiring a specialized locksmith, an action he dared not take while maintaining a low profile. He underestimated my grandfather. Harrison valued symmetry. He despised carrying excessive keys on his ring. Decades ago, he commissioned a master smith to configure his private Cape Cod study door and this nautical lockbox to accept the exact same key. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers wrapped around the jagged brass profile I had rescued from the coastal estate. The metal carried the latent heat of my own body. I guided the key toward the narrow slot on the front of the vault. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my eardrums. If the internal pins had degraded over time, or if Thomas had somehow forced a different mechanism inside, the metal would jam. My entire strategy rested on a piece of antique hardware. I slid the brass shaft into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. I gripped the ornate bow of the key and applied steady, deliberate pressure to the right. The internal tumblers rotated. A heavy, oiled click resonated in the quiet room. The latch released. I exhaled a breath I had been holding for the last 2 minutes. I unfastened the brass clasps and lifted the heavy wooden lid. The interior smelled of old parchment and dry binding glue. Resting on a bed of faded green velvet was the master ledger. It was a thick, imposing book bound in dark calfskin. The leather showed the wear of countless audits, the corners softened by decades of handling. This singular volume contained the unredacted history of Atlantic maritime logistics. I lifted the ledger from the box, resting the heavy book on the rug. I retrieved my smartphone from my blazer pocket, ensuring the camera flash was disabled. I opened the thick leather cover. The first section housed the foundational architecture of the corporation. I flipped past the original shareholder agreements and localized the critical documents. The Articles of Incorporation stared back at me, bearing the faded signatures of Harrison and his initial partners. These pages represented the missing half of my map. Combined with the notarized proxy resting in my apartment, these articles granted me irrevocable executive authority. I held my phone steady, framing the yellowed parchment within the digital screen. I tapped the capture button, snapping crisp, high-resolution images of every single page. I documented the bylaws, the voting rights structures, and the succession clauses. The digital files saved directly to an encrypted cloud server, ensuring the evidence would survive even if Thomas discovered me in the next 60 seconds. The primary objective was secure, I possessed the ammunition required to walk into any boardroom and legally terminate my father's employment. I needed to return the ledger to the box and slip back to the dining room before Evelyn realized my powder room visit was taking too long. But the instinct of a senior corporate auditor is a relentless force. You do not simply verify the title page of an account. You examine the recent activity. I needed to see how much capital Thomas had drained since Harrison fell ill. I turned to the back of the book, seeking the most recent manual entries. Harrison insisted on tracking high-level operating budgets by hand, maintaining a physical backup to the digital servers. I illuminated the final pages using the dim glow of my phone screen. My eyes scanned the familiar slanted handwriting of my grandfather. The columns detailed routine fleet maintenance, international port tariffs, and standard payroll expenditures. Then the handwriting changed. The elegant slanted script was replaced by rigid block lettering. Thomas had taken over the ledger. The dates aligned with the weeks immediately following Harrison's initial hospitalization, long before his heart stopped. I traced the rows of numbers, my brain automatically calculating the sums. The figures detailed transfers from the corporate operating budget into external holding accounts. I expected to see greedy withdrawals, perhaps a few million, routed to offshore trusts or luxury real estate purchases. But the scale of the digits printed on the page defied standard embezzlement. I stared at a specific column labeled Collateral Reallocation. The outbound transfer sums were staggering. They were not siphoning minor profits. They were moving colossal blocks of foundational capital. I checked the corresponding destination accounts. They were not shell companies. They were high-risk, leveraged investment portfolios registered under the personal names of Thomas and Preston Davis. My breath caught in my throat. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. An auditor recognizes a fatal deficit instantly. Thomas and Preston had not waited for Harrison to die. Months ago, they engaged in reckless, highly speculative stock trading. They had utilized their limited executive access to pledge the shipping company's operational assets as collateral for their own personal margin accounts. The market had turned against them. I found the most recent entry dated mere days before the forged trust amendment was executed. It was a margin call from a major institutional lender. The demand was explicit. The personal portfolios were underwater, carrying a deficit of $40 million. If the debt remained unsettled by the end of the current fiscal week, the lender would seize the collateralized corporate assets, triggering a federal audit and exposing the unauthorized leverage. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The forged trust amendment, the sudden frantic rush to sell the entire holding company to a private equity firm, the desperate attempt to bribe me with $100,000 to drop a fake real estate lawsuit. They were not acting out of simple greed. They were acting out of pure, unadulterated terror. The private equity sale was a smokescreen designed to generate an immediate cash influx. They intended to use the liquidation proceeds to quietly erase the $40 million debt before the Securities and Exchange Commission noticed the missing capital. I lowered my phone, the screen casting a pale blue light across the dark leather binding. My father and my brother had committed staggering securities fraud. If the private equity sale failed, they would not just lose their wealth, they would face decades in a federal penitentiary. I was no longer dealing with a family dispute over a coastal house. I had just uncovered a catastrophic financial crime. I closed the ledger, my hands trembling slightly. I needed to get back to the dining room and look into the eyes of the men whose freedom now rested entirely in my pocket. The stark red ink pressed into the ledger paper burned a permanent image into my retinas. $40 million. An auditor learns early in her training that mathematics possess no allegiance. Numbers do not care about bloodlines, social status, or tailored suits. They exist as pure, unadulterated facts. The fact staring back at me from the weathered pages of my grandfather's historical record was a tragedy of staggering arrogance. Thomas and Preston possessed immense privilege, commanding wealth most citizens could scarcely comprehend. Yet their access proved insufficient to satisfy their appetites. The columns detailed a narrative of reckless entitlement. 8 months ago, long before Harrison ever stepped foot inside an intensive care unit, my father and my brother initiated a series of highly speculative, leveraged stock trades. They utilized their personal brokerage accounts, chasing exponential returns in volatile markets. The market shifted against their positions with brutal efficiency. Their broker issued a margin call, demanding immediate liquid capital to cover the widening deficit. Instead of accepting the financial loss and liquidating their own personal assets to satisfy the debt, they made a fatal, illegal pivot. They reached into the secure vault of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. They exploited their limited executive access to pledge the shipping company's operational infrastructure. They used cargo vessels, international port contracts, and commercial shipping routes as collateral to back their personal margin accounts. That single desperate maneuver constituted textbook federal securities fraud. I traced the accounting row across the page, my finger stopping at the deadline date written in rigid block lettering. The institutional lender required the $40 million deficit balanced by this upcoming Friday. The timeline illuminated the dark, chaotic events of the past week like a flare fired over a battlefield. The frantic rush to bury Harrison, the mysterious buyers sitting in the third row during a solemn religious service, the forged trust amendment designed to instantly bypass the slow public scrutiny of probate court. My family needed uncontested authority to sell the entire holding company to a private equity firm before the week ended. They intended to use the massive influx of acquisition cash to quietly erase their personal debt before the Securities and Exchange Commission initiated a standard quarterly audit. If that Friday deadline passed without a finalized corporate sale, the broker would legally seize the collateralized ships. The sudden loss of foundational assets would trigger a federal criminal investigation. My father and my brother would exchange their Beacon Hill brownstone for federal penitentiary cells. I raised my smartphone, ensuring the camera focus locked onto the damning red columns. I captured dozens of high-resolution images, verifying the clarity of each exposure. The digital files uploaded directly to my encrypted cloud server, securing the evidence far beyond their physical reach. I closed the heavy calfskin cover. The scent of old leather and binding glue filled the narrow space beneath the desk as I placed the book back onto the faded green velvet lining of the vintage maritime lockbox. I lowered the mahogany lid, aligning the brass clasps. I inserted the antique key into the archaic tumbler mechanism and turned it to the left. A heavy, oiled click resonated through the quiet study, sealing the vault. I slipped the cold brass back into my blazer pocket. The ambient temperature in the room felt different now. The oppressive weight of my father's authority had completely evaporated. For 34 years, Thomas projected the image of an untouchable titan, a man who controlled the climate inside our family through sheer force of will. That illusion shattered on the hardwood floor. He was not a calculated mastermind executing a flawless corporate takeover. He was a terrified, drowning man, thrashing in deep water, dragging his own bloodline under the surface just to steal another breath. The brutal lockout at the Cape Cod estate, the targeted defamation campaign within Boston high society, the engineered suspension of my auditing career, none of those actions stemmed from strategic malice or personal spite. They stemmed from raw, unfiltered panic. I was a variable he could not control, a trained investigator standing far too close to an active crime scene. He needed me, blind broke and paralyzed, chasing a fabricated real estate lawsuit while he finalized his escape plan. The paradigm of my existence shifted in the span of 3 minutes. I was no longer a grieving granddaughter fighting for a stolen inheritance. I was no longer the outcast daughter seeking validation from a table of predators. I was the executioner, and I held a razor-sharp axe. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal trousers. I navigated the dark room, moving with silent precision. I opened the study door a fraction of an inch, listening to the corridor. The hallway remained empty. The faint clinking of crystal and silver drifted from the formal dining room, accompanied by the low hum of relaxed conversation. I retraced my steps down the thick Persian runner, walking toward the warm golden light spilling from the arched doorway. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm against my throat. I paused just outside the threshold, observing the scene, before making my presence known. Preston was laughing at a comment. Thomas made a sharp, arrogant sound that echoed off the expensive floral centerpieces. Evelyn offered a soft, agreeable murmur, sipping from her delicate wineglass. Clara sat quietly, maintaining her role as the passive observer. They were celebrating their perceived victory. They believed the psychological siege had worked. They believed the insulting $100,000 buyout resting on the linen tablecloth would secure their salvation and guarantee my permanent silence. I adjusted the cuffs of my white silk blouse, letting the fabric settle perfectly against my wrists. I stepped into the light and crossed the threshold, returning to the single, empty chair positioned at the far end of the long mahogany table. 4 heads turned to look at me, their shark-like smiles firmly in place, entirely unaware that the woman sitting across from them now possessed the power to end their lives. My name had not been crossed out. It had been deleted entirely. The margins of the heavy cream paper were perfectly justified to hide the space where I used to exist. I stood in the stone vestibule of the cathedral in Back Bay, Boston. The November rain battered the stained glass windows, and the air inside carried the dense scent of wet wool, burning wax, and lilies. I held the funeral program in my gloved hand, my thumb tracing the embossed lettering. Thomas Davis, Evelyn Davis, Preston Davis. The ink listed the surviving family of Harrison Davis, founder of Atlantic Maritime Logistics. I was 34 years old. I shared his last name, and I had eaten Sunday breakfast with him every week for a decade. According to this piece of expensive cardstock, I was a ghost. You need to step outside. The voice belonged to my father, Thomas. He materialized from the shadows of the arched doorway, his broad frame blocking my line of sight to the altar. He wore a tailored charcoal morning suit, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a hard line. I looked up from the program, maintaining a level gaze. "My seat is usually in the second row, Thomas." "Your seat is gone," he whispered. His tone dropped to a sharp, controlled register designed not to carry. "We cannot afford any disruptions today. This service requires a pristine family image. You were never really part of this family, Kaylee. You are an auditor who happened to share a dinner table. Now leave before I have the ushers remove you." My profession relies on spotting discrepancies in ledgers and reading behavioral anomalies in corporate boardrooms. Panic usually hides behind bluster. I did not argue. I did not let my voice shake. Instead, my gaze drifted past his tense shoulder. A few feet away, near the velvet ropes securing the front pews, my mother Evelyn stood adjusting my brother Preston's silk tie. She smoothed the lapel of his custom suit and leaned in close. "Chin up," Evelyn murmured, her voice cutting through the low, mournful hum of the organ. "The buyers are sitting in the third row. Look the part." Buyers. The word snagged in my mind like a torn thread. Harrison's heart had stopped 3 days ago. A funeral was a space for grief, not acquisition. Yet Preston stood there looking less like a mourning grandson and more like a hedge fund manager preparing for a hostile takeover. I looked back at my father. The hostility in his eyes was a familiar fixture of my childhood, but the tight, frantic energy radiating from him was entirely new. He wasn't just embarrassed by my presence. He was terrified of me crossing that threshold. Creating a scene here would only give Evelyn the ammunition she needed to paint me as the unstable daughter. Logic dictated a strategic retreat. I folded the heavy cream program, slipped it into the pocket of my coat, and pivoted toward the exit. Before my hand reached the cold brass handle, the heavy oak doors swung open from the outside, letting in a bitter gust of Massachusetts wind. Julian Sterling stood in the threshold. He was Harrison's private corporate counsel, a man who billed by the minute, despised small talk, and rarely left his high-rise corner office. His trench coat was soaked, and he was breathing hard. Thomas immediately stepped forward, painting on a polished, grieving executive's smile. "Julian, thank you for coming. We have a seat reserved for you down front." Sterling ignored him. He walked straight past my father, his wet shoes squeaking against the marble floor, and stopped inches from me. He reached inside his leather satchel and extracted a thick manila envelope. My eyes dropped to the closure. It wasn't sealed with standard legal tape. A heavy stamp of red wax secured the flap, bearing the deep impression of a compass rose. "Ms. Davis Sterling," said, his voice echoing in the quiet stone vestibule. He held the envelope out, bypassing the family entirely. "Your grandfather left strict instructions. This is yours." I stepped out of the shadowed corridor and returned to the radiant glow of the formal dining room. My leather soles traversed the thick carpet without producing a single sound. The transition felt like crossing a border between two different realities. 5 minutes ago, I was a grieving relative searching for answers. Now, I was a forensic executioner holding the precise coordinates of their ruin. The staging remained immaculate. The crystal chandelier cast a warm golden illumination over the polished mahogany board. My family sat in their designated positions, forming a united front of calculated predation. They turned their heads in unison as I crossed the threshold. The dramatic irony of the tableau was profound. They looked at me with varying shades of manufactured pity and concealed triumph, believing the brief intermission had broken my spirit. They thought I spent the last few minutes weeping into a porcelain sink, mourning a fabricated real estate lawsuit. They had zero concept that I had just held their federal prison sentences in the palm of my hand. I walked the length of the room and resumed my seat at the far end of the long table. The physical isolation they engineered no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a judge taking the bench. "Are you feeling better, darling?" Evelyn asked. Her voice flowed like synthetic honey coating the silence in the room. Her manicured fingers rested lightly on the stem of her wineglass. We were growing worried. "I am fine, Evelyn," I replied, keeping my vocal cords relaxed and my pitch even. I just needed a moment to gain some clarity. Preston scoffed, swirling the rare amber scotch inside his crystal tumbler. The ice clinked against the expensive glass, a sharp, arrogant rhythm. "Clarity is exactly what you need, Kaylee. You are staring down the barrel of a decade-long civil dispute you cannot afford to fight. Your bank accounts are bleeding. Your auditing firm locked you out. The smart play is to recognize when the board is swept. Take the settlement and move on with whatever is left of your life." My brother spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a genuine consequence. He wore his bespoke suit like a suit of armor, assuming his inherited wealth made him invincible. He did not realize his armor was collateralized, owned by an institutional lender who was preparing to foreclose on his entire existence. I did not offer Preston a verbal response. Instead, I reached for the plain glass resting near my plate. The dark red liquid inside was the cheap pedestrian vintage Thomas had poured to mock my financial suspension. I lifted the rim to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The wine tasted bitter and thin, a stark contrast to the rich legacy they were currently stealing. I lowered the glass, my eyes tracking across the length of the linen tablecloth, until they locked onto my father. Thomas sat at the head of the arrangement. His broad shoulders squared his jaw, set in a line of patriarchal authority. He interpreted my quiet action as submission. He believed the cheap wine was a communion of my defeat. "Let us finalize this transaction," Thomas announced, his tone shifting into the smooth, commanding cadence he utilized to close corporate acquisitions. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He tapped his index finger against the folded legal waiver, resting near my empty dinner plate. "This contract represents the end of the hostilities," my father continued. "We are offering you a generous severance from the estate, $100,000. It is a soft landing, Kaylee. It provides you with the capital necessary to secure a new apartment, perhaps relocate to a different city, and start over without the burden of this family drama dragging you down." He paused, letting the silence stretch, attempting to force me into a desperate interjection. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded softly in my lap. The lack of reaction unsettled him slightly, prompting him to press harder. "If you refuse to sign that document tonight," Thomas warned, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register designed to intimidate. The offer evaporates. Tomorrow morning, my legal team will file a countersuit against your frivolous property injunction. We will bury you under a mountain of discovery motions and procedural delays. You will spend every remaining dime you possess trying to depose lawyers who charge $1,000 an hour. You will be rendered entirely destitute. He reached inside the breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He withdrew a sleek, gold-plated fountain pen. He extended his arm, sliding the heavy writing instrument across the polished mahogany surface. The gold cylinder rolled to a halt, resting precisely next to the signature line of the legal waiver. "Pick up the pen," Kaylee Thomas commanded. "Sign the waiver. Take the money, and remember your place in the hierarchy. You were never built to run this empire. You are just a bean counter. Leave the heavy lifting to the men who understand how the world actually operates." The silence in the dining room became suffocating. Evelyn held her breath, a victorious gleam shining in her eyes. Clara watched me with a tight, expectant expression, believing her Trojan horse performance had successfully steered me into this surrender. Preston offered a lazy, triumphant grin, anticipating the exact moment I would break. I looked down at the gold pen. I looked at the bold numerical figure printed on the crisp white paper. $100,000 in exchange for $1 billion maritime holding company. I reached out with my right hand. My fingertips brushed the cool metal of the writing instrument. The four predators sitting around the table collectively exhaled, secure in their victory. I picked up the fountain pen. I held it in the air for a fraction of a second, feeling the balanced weight of the gold. Then, with slow, agonizing precision, I pulled the matching gold cap from the back of the cylinder. I brought the cap forward and snapped it firmly over the nib. Click. The sharp metallic sound echoed off the crystal chandelier. I placed the capped pen back onto the table. I rested my index finger against the edge of the legal waiver. Applying a steady, even pressure, I pushed the crisp paper forward. The document slid across the linen tablecloth, traversing the distance between us until it came to a halt directly in front of my father's plate. I lifted my chin, meeting his arrogant gaze with unyielding calm. "The estate is not yours to buy me out of, Thomas." My voice contained zero emotion. It held no grief, no fear, no anger. It was the flat, declarative tone of an auditor delivering a fatal discrepancy report. The smug facade covering my father's face fractured instantly. The patronizing patriarch vanished, replaced by a surge of raw, untethered panic. He stared at the rejected waiver, his brain struggling to process the defiance. The transaction was supposed to be finished. The escape plan required my signature. Without it, the $40 million anvil hovering over his head began to drop. Thomas erupted. He slammed his closed fist onto the mahogany surface with a force that rattled the expensive china and sent a shockwave through the crystal wine glasses. "You arrogant fool," he screamed, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. The polished corporate persona shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You have no leverage. You have no resources. You are walking into a slaughter. When the banks open on Monday morning, I will ensure you are erased from the financial sector. You will be destitute. You will have nothing." Evelyn gasped, clutching her linen napkin against her chest, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway, terrified the household staff might witness the loss of control. Preston sat frozen, his glass of rare scotch hovering halfway to his mouth, his arrogant smirk wiped clean by the sudden, explosive volume. I did not flinch. The screaming merely confirmed the diagnosis I had compiled in the darkened study. The volume of his threat was directly proportional to the depth of his terror. I stood up from the single chair. I smoothed the fabric of my charcoal trousers. I reached for the lapels of my tailored blazer. With deliberate, measured movements, I pulled the two sides of the jacket together. I fastened the center button securing the fabric directly over the right pocket. The pocket that held the encrypted smartphone containing the photographs of the master ledger, the corporate proxy, and the undeniable proof of his federal securities fraud. I did not offer a parting remark. I did not waste another syllable on a room full of ghosts. I turned my back on the screaming man at the head of the table. I walked out of the formal dining room, my leather soles striking the hardwood floor with a steady, commanding rhythm. I navigated the grand foyer, reached for the heavy front door, and pulled it open. The cool, crisp air of the Beacon Hill night washed over my face. I stepped out onto the stone stoop, pulling the door shut behind me, leaving the architects of my suffering trapped inside their own collapsing fortress. The trap was fully primed, and the boardroom awaited. Friday morning broke over the Boston harbor with a crisp, blinding clarity. Sunlight reflected off the dark water, casting bright, shifting patterns across the glass walls of the Atlantic Maritime Logistics corporate headquarters. The executive boardroom occupied the entire top floor, a sprawling monument to Harrison Davis and his lifelong ambition. The space smelled of expensive roasted coffee, leather upholstery, and the sharp scent of dry erase markers. Thomas stood at the head of the expansive mahogany conference table, delivering the performance of his lifetime. He wore an immaculate navy blue suit, his posture projecting the supreme confidence of a visionary chief executive. Preston sat to his right, mirroring his father's sartorial precision, nodding thoughtfully at calculated intervals. They were hosting a delegation from Vanguard Capital Partners, a ruthless private equity firm renowned for acquiring legacy corporations, liquidating their physical assets, and selling off the remaining components for exorbitant profits. The acquisition team consisted of 3 senior partners. They sat across the table, their attention fixed on the digital presentation illuminated on the far wall. They were wholly unaware of the $40 million margin call hovering over the men pitching them the sale. They possessed zero knowledge regarding the forged trust amendment or the stolen master ledger. As far as the buyers were concerned, the paperwork was immaculate, the transition of power was legally seamless, and the logistics empire was ripe for a lucrative harvest. A junior associate from Vanguard reached out and lifted a crystal tumbler resting near his leather portfolio. He took a slow sip of sparkling water. The moisture condensed on the outside of the glass, obscuring the etched emblem near the base. It was the compass rose. Harrison had commissioned the glassware decades ago, a subtle reminder to his board of directors that the company must always maintain its true bearing, regardless of the economic weather. My father ignored the symbolism entirely. He pressed a button on a sleek remote, shifting the digital slide to a graph depicting projected revenue spikes following a severe workforce reduction. We are talking about modernizing the fleet and trimming the administrative fat. Thomas explained, his tone carrying a smooth, persuasive rhythm. Atlantic Maritime carries a tremendous amount of historical bloat. By consolidating the shipping routes and restructuring the terminal contracts, your firm will see a return on investment within the first 2 fiscal quarters. We have already secured the necessary regulatory approvals to expedite the transition. Our logistics network represents a turnkey operation ready for immediate optimization. The lead private equity partner, a sharp-featured woman named Catherine, leaned forward. She rested her forearms on the polished wood, studying the projected figures. The numbers are undeniably attractive, Thomas. Harrison built a sturdy vessel, but it requires a ruthless captain to navigate the current market conditions. Assuming the legal team has finalized the transfer of the voting shares, Vanguard is prepared to authorize the initial capital injection today. We recognize the value of acting decisively. Preston allowed a tight, triumphant grin to touch the corners of his mouth. He glanced at his father, sharing a fleeting look of profound relief. They had survived the deadline. The substantial influx of acquisition cash would hit their accounts by mid-afternoon, allowing them to quietly erase the catastrophic broker debt before the federal auditors ever noticed a discrepancy. They believed their psychological siege at the Beacon Hill brownstone had neutralized my threat. They assumed I was currently sitting in a cramped apartment drafting a pathetic real estate injunction while they sold my grandfather's legacy to the highest bidder. The sheer arrogance of their assumption blinded them to the reality approaching their stronghold. Thomas deactivated the projector. The room brightened as the automated blinds rolled upward, revealing the sweeping view of the harbor below. Heavy leather binders containing the final liquidation contracts were distributed around the table. The documents were thick, filled with dense legal clauses and binding transfer agreements. Each page represented a dismantled piece of my grandfather's life work, reduced to a fractional percentage on a private equity balance sheet. Catherine opened her binder, produced a silver fountain pen, and signed her name with a practiced flourish on the designated dotted line. She pushed the leather folder across the mahogany surface toward my father. "Your turn, Thomas," Catherine said, offering a professional, shark-like smile. "Let us finalize this partnership." Thomas reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He extracted the same gold-plated writing instrument he had used to taunt me 2 nights prior. The pen caught the morning sunlight, gleaming like a weapon. He pulled the cap from the cylinder, the metallic click echoing softly in the quiet boardroom. He positioned the gold nib over the thick paper, ready to sign away 60 years of maritime history. His hand hovered over the signature line. The transaction was mere seconds away from becoming permanent law. Before the ink could touch the parchment, the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom slid apart on their silent tracks. I stepped across the threshold, bringing the crisp, uncompromising reality of an audit into their sanctuary. I wore a tailored black suit, my posture rigid, my expression wiped clean of any familial deference. I did not enter the room alone. Julian Sterling flanked my right side. The formidable corporate attorney carried a battered leather satchel, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. To my left walked a uniformed county bailiff, a heavy brass badge pinned to his chest, his presence introducing an immediate, undeniable layer of judicial authority into the corporate space. The sudden intrusion severed the tension in the room like a physical blade. The conversation halted instantly. Catherine lowered her silver pen, her eyes darting between my father and the uniformed officer. The junior associates from Vanguard shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, sensing a catastrophic legal entanglement unfolding before them. The quiet hum of the climate control system became the only sound in the expansive executive suite. Thomas froze. The gold pen remained suspended in midair. The polished, visionary chief executive persona evaporated, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed mask of unadulterated terror. He stared at me, his pupils dilated, his mind struggling to comprehend how the exiled daughter had breached the highest level of his fortress. The confident predator I had faced in the dining room was gone, reduced to a trembling fraud caught in the snare of his own deception. Preston pushed his chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floorboards, a guttural sound of panic escaping his throat. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like an ill-fitting costume on a frightened child. I walked slowly toward the head of the mahogany table, my heels clicking a steady, methodical rhythm against the polished hardwood. I stopped exactly 3 feet from my father. I did not yell. I did not offer a polite greeting. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, letting the silence stretch until the weight of his impending ruin settled firmly upon his shoulders. The dramatic irony of our previous encounter had reached its terminal velocity. The illusion was shattered. The execution had officially begun. The silence hung in the boardroom heavy and unbreakable, until my father's survival instinct finally fractured it. He dropped his gold pen onto the mahogany table. The metal clattered against the wood, a sharp sound that echoed throughout the cavernous executive suite. Security Thomas barked, his voice cracking, devoid of its usual booming resonance. He pointed a trembling finger toward the glass doors. "Remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled former employee trespassing on a restricted floor." I did not even glance in his direction. I kept my focus entirely fixed on Catherine, the lead partner from Vanguard Capital. I stepped up to the edge of the table, placing my hands flat against the polished surface. "Catherine," I said, projecting a calm, measured cadence, "before you authorize a single wire transfer, I strongly suggest you review the ownership chain of this corporation. The men sitting across from you do not possess the legal authority to sell a single life raft, let alone the entire fleet. Thomas slammed his fist down. "Do not listen to her. She is enduring a psychiatric episode. We have the approved trust amendment signed and filed by the probate judge." Julian Sterling stepped forward, placing his battered leather satchel onto the table. He did not yell. He spoke with the lethal precision of a senior litigator preparing to dismantle an opponent in open court. "The trust amendment you filed is irrelevant," Sterling stated, pulling a thick stack of documents from his bag. 2 years prior to his death, Harrison Davis restructured Atlantic Maritime Logistics. He removed the corporate assets from his personal estate and placed them into an irrevocable blind trust. "The paperwork you hold only governs his checking accounts and real estate. You cannot sell what you do not own." Preston stood up his chair, tipping backward and hitting the floor with a loud crack. "That is a lie," he shouted, his face draining of all color. "We are the primary executors." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I retrieved the crisp, heavy parchment I had rescued from the wax-sealed envelope. I unfolded the document, smoothing the creases. It was the original corporate proxy, authenticated by the missing articles of incorporation I had photographed in my father's study. I slid the document across the long mahogany table. The paper glided over the polished wood, carried by its own momentum, until it came to a precise halt, exactly in front of Catherine. My grandfather appointed me as the sole managing director and the irrevocable majority shareholder, I explained, watching the private equity executive lower her gaze to read the text. "I hold 60% of the voting stock. The signatures you just gathered are legally worthless." Catherine possessed decades of experience navigating corporate warfare. She did not need a team of lawyers to translate the threat. She recognized the authentic notary seal, Harrison's distinct signature, and the airtight legal phrasing. She looked up from the parchment, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to Arctic detachment. A forged sale of this magnitude would entangle her firm in years of toxic litigation. She closed her leather binder with a definitive snap. She stood up, signaling her junior associates to do the same. "Vanguard Capital is withdrawing its acquisition offer effective immediately," Catherine announced, buttoning her jacket. "Thomas, do not ever contact my office again." The private equity executives marched toward the glass doors, bypassing my father without a second glance. The exit was swift and brutal. The lifeblood of their escape plan vanished into the corridor, leaving Thomas and Preston stranded in the wreckage of their own arrogance. The junior associates followed their boss, the zippers of their briefcases sounding like closing body bags. Panic flooded the boardroom. Preston gripped the edge of the table, hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Evelyn, who had arrived quietly earlier to celebrate the anticipated champagne toast, stood frozen near the back wall, her hands covering her mouth in horror. Thomas turned his rage toward me, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. "I will destroy you for this," he seethed, saliva flying from his lips. "I will sue you into oblivion. I will drag you through civil court until you are begging for a settlement. You just cost this family hundreds of millions of dollars." I stood perfectly still, letting his threat hang in the air. The intimidation tactics that governed my childhood felt weak and hollow now. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a secondary, thicker folder. "You are not going to file a lawsuit, Thomas," I replied, my voice dropping into a flat clinical register. "You are not going to contact a lawyer, because if you do, I will submit this forensic accounting report directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission." I tossed the folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. I read the master ledger. I continued watching the last trace of color drain from my father's cheeks. I tracked the outbound capital reallocations. 8 months ago, you and Preston pledged the operational assets of this shipping empire as collateral to cover a $40 million margin call on your personal brokerage accounts. You committed federal securities fraud. The debt is due today. Without the Vanguard acquisition money, you will default. The threat of a civil lawsuit died instantly. The reality of a federal penitentiary descended upon the room, silencing the bravado. Preston collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, emitting a low, pathetic whimper. Thomas stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. "I am the managing director of this holding company," I stated, delivering the verdict. "I have the authority to report the embezzlement, which will result in your immediate arrest. Or I can choose to cover the margin call using corporate reserves, absorbing your debt into the company ledger. But I will only authorize that payment under my own specific terms." I withdrew a final stack of legal paperwork prepared by Sterling earlier that morning. "You will vacate the Cape Cod estate by sundown," I ordered, my tone devoid of mercy. "You will surrender the Boston brownstone. You will sign over the titles to the luxury vehicles, the overseas accounts, and the shared trust funds Preston holds with Clara. Every liquid asset you possess will be transferred to Atlantic Maritime Logistics as restitution for the capital you stole. You will walk away from this empire with nothing but the clothes you are wearing." Evelyn rushed forward, her heels stumbling on the carpet. She reached out, tears streaming down her carefully preserved face, her manicured fingers grasping at my sleeve. "Kaylee, please," she sobbed, her voice high and desperate. "You cannot do this. We are your parents. We are your family. Have some mercy." I looked down at her hands, remembering the way she had smoothed Preston's tie at the funeral, prioritizing corporate optics over my existence. I remembered the country club's smear campaign, designed to starve me into submission. She wanted mercy only when the leverage had evaporated. I gently but firmly removed her fingers from my jacket. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life treating my love as a transactional commodity. "I was never really part of this family," I said, echoing the exact words my father had whispered to me in the church vestibule. I let the sentence hang, watching the realization dawn in their eyes. I am just the auditor, and this account is closed. I slid the restitution paperwork and a cheap plastic ballpoint pen across the table. Thomas stared at the documents, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the comprehension of his total defeat. He looked at the uniformed bailiff standing silently near the door, then back to the contract. His hands shook uncontrollably as he picked up the pen. He leaned over the mahogany table and signed his name, surrendering his wealth, his status, and his curated image with one jagged signature. The poetic justice was undeniable. The man who tried to erase my name to preserve his high society standing was now destined to become a pariah. Stripped of his assets, Thomas would be forced to resign from his elite charity boards in disgrace, an outcast in the very circles he worshipped. The facade was permanently broken. He had traded his legacy for an illusion, and the illusion had bankrupted him. 3 days later, the autumn wind whipped across the gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt and pine. I stood alone in the foyer of the Cape Cod house. The property was silent, emptied of the toxic ambition that had briefly infected its walls. Vanguard security was gone. The electronic deadbolt had been removed, replaced by a traditional mechanism installed by a local locksmith. I walked down the familiar hallway and pushed open the door to Harrison's private study. The room remained just as my grandfather had kept it before the raid. The maritime oil painting hung straight on the wall. The velvet curtains framed the sprawling view of the rocky coastline. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk. I reached into my pocket and withdrew the antique brass key. The metal felt warm against my palm, a solid reminder of the storm I had navigated. I placed the key directly onto the center of the polished wood, right where the master ledger used to sit. The columns were balanced. The fraud was neutralized. The legacy was secure. I stood in the quiet sanctuary looking out at the horizon, knowing with unwavering certainty that I had left the room better than I found it. Every family maintains a ledger. For most of us, this accounting remains invisible, hidden in the quiet, unrecorded moments around a crowded dining room table. It is measured in whispered words of encouragement, shared burdens, and the steady, unwavering pulse of unconditional support. But what happens when a family begins to measure a child's worth by their utility, their compliance, or their ability to uphold a curated public image? The tragedy of the Davis family was not the sudden loss of a billion-dollar maritime shipping empire. The true catastrophe occurred decades earlier, in the silent hours when Thomas and Evelyn decided that love was a transaction, They constructed a formidable fortress of generational wealth, but they forgot to build a home. In modern American culture, the relentless pursuit of success often casts a chilling shadow over the traditional family structure. We are conditioned to praise ambition, to celebrate the acquisition of executive titles, and to revere the accumulation of capital. Yet the foundational responsibility of parenting cannot be outsourced to trust funds or elite country club memberships. Raising a child requires profound fairness, a deeply rooted commitment to seeing each child for their inherent humanity, rather than evaluating what they can contribute to the family brand. Thomas and Evelyn looked at Preston and saw a convenient reflection of their own ego, an heir who could be molded to wear custom suits and inherit the boardroom. They looked at Kaylee and saw a liability, an independent mind that refused to conform to their fragile illusions. By playing favorites, these parents did not merely alienate a daughter, they crippled a son. They bestowed vast privilege upon Preston without providing the crucial anchor of character, leaving him entirely defenseless when the real storms of life finally arrived. True family responsibility demands that we equip our children with the moral fortitude to face their own failures. When we shield them from consequences in the name of preserving an image, we are not protecting them. We are setting a trap they will inevitably spring on themselves. The dining room table is perhaps the most sacred architecture in the American home. It is the gathering place where values are passed down alongside the evening meal. It is where the day is dissected, where triumphs are celebrated, and where mistakes are met with grace and guidance. In the Davis household, the table was repurposed into a hostile tribunal. The cheap wine poured for Kaylee was not just an insult, it was a physical manifestation of conditional affection. When children sit at a table where they feel they must constantly earn their right to belong, they learn that affection is a commodity. As parents, the heaviest, most vital responsibility we bear is ensuring that the seat we offer our children is permanent, irrevocable, and free of charge. If we fail in this, we send them out into the world believing they must perpetually audit their own worth. Emotional awareness is the quiet, sustaining heartbeat of any healthy family. It is the ability to sit across from your child, look past their achievements or their defiance, and understand their internal landscape. The Davis family operated in a state of profound emotional bankruptcy. They communicated through ultimatums, couriered letters, and formal waivers slid across polished mahogany. When parents replace genuine connection with rigid control, they cultivate a culture of fear, and fear is the fertile soil where deceit takes root. The forged trust amendment, the hidden $40 million broker debt, these were not merely federal crimes. They were the ultimate symptoms of a family that had lost the capacity to tell each other the truth. When a home lacks the safety required for honesty, children learn to hide. Some hide their mistakes, much like Preston burying his failures under layers of collateralized debt and arrogance. Others hide their hearts, much like Kaylee retreating behind the cold, impenetrable logic of a corporate spreadsheet, because the humans in her life proved to be unreliable variables. Raising children with high emotional intelligence requires parents to model vulnerability. Thomas could not admit his financial miscalculations, and that toxic pride destroyed his lineage. If he had possessed the humility to admit his errors, the family might have lost their fortune, but they would have retained their souls. True long-term parental guidance is not about clearing the path for your children. It is about handing them a reliable compass. Harrison understood this fundamental truth. While Thomas was busy orchestrating public relations optics, the grandfather was sitting on a cedar porch teaching a young girl how to read a profit and loss statement. He was not just teaching her mathematics, he was instilling the ability to identify the truth in a world obsessed with selling fiction. He gave her a moral and intellectual framework capable of withstanding a hurricane. A traditional family structure thrives when the elders provide this kind of enduring vision. It requires the humility to realize that we will not always be present to shield our children from the wind. We must equip them with the integrity to navigate treacherous waters on their own. Harrison's enduring legacy was not the maritime fleet. His legacy was the unshakable resilience he cultivated within Kaylee. When we strip away the bespoke suits, the historic Beacon Hill properties, and the private equity negotiations, what remains is a universal cautionary tale. A family cannot survive on the fumes of an illusion. If parents demand strict compliance instead of fostering deep connection, if they prioritize the preservation of their social standing over the protection of their children, the eventual collapse is inescapable. They purchased an expensive peace, only to discover that peace, bought with silence, is just a debt collecting interest. As you reflect on the dynamics within your own walls, consider the legacy you are building. Are you leaving behind a ledger of transactions or a compass pointing toward unwavering truth? We explore these deep, intricate webs of family betrayal and consequence every week. If this narrative resonated with you, if you have ever had to stand your ground against the people who share your name, hit the subscribe button and join our community at Linda Vengeance. We give a voice to the quiet ones who finally balance the scales. The story of the corporate heir ends in a quiet, empty coastal house. Kaylee secured the legacy, and she protected her grandfather's name, but she is standing in the room alone. It is a victory that requires a heavy sacrifice, forcing us to ask a haunting question as we turn out the lights in our own homes tonight. When the storm finally passes and the truth strips away all the illusions we have so carefully built, who will still be sitting at your table?